recording. You can go anytime.
Thank you. My name is Nancy Dillette. I'm an oral historian at the Arizona State University, and today is Tuesday, June 1st, 2004. I'm joined by Noel Stowe, chair of the History Department at Arizona State University and director of the Public History Program. Together, we're continuing to interview Arizona City County Management Life members for the ACMA Oral History Project. We're conducting interview number 4 today with Robert Brunton, who served 6 cities across the nation, as well as the ICMA. And most importantly for our purposes, he served as deputy manager in Phoenix from 1977 to 1986. And later, we're also going to be joined by Bob's wife, Ruth, and introduce the subject of the pivotal role of the family in the lives of city managers. We're in the studios of Channel 11, the City of Phoenix cable station, and we're hoping to document the history of life members in order to share the values and principles of people who created the strong council-manager form of government, and also to help new generations to clarify the role of the manager. So let's begin with your early story, Mr. Brunton, and tell us where and when you were born.
I was born in Jersey City, New Jersey, and lived there until I went into the service.
What year were you born?
I was born in 1923.
Okay.
And when I graduated from high school, I went in January of 1941. I went into engineering at Newark College of Engineering, where I spent 3 years. I was in the reserves, and at the end of 3 years, they called us up to active duty. So I served in active duty for about 3 years.
And what attracted you to engineering originally?
My brother was in engineering, and I was good in math. But I later found out that that was by taking some testing, was not my first career choice.
What was your first career choice? And tell us about the nature of the testing.
Well, it was more of a system of first knowing I want to work more with people. And I first thought about the ministry, and was already talking with Yale University about going to seminary there. And I also was interested in social work. So when I went in the service, the dilemma was I had finished 3 years of engineering. And so when I got out of the service 3 years later, I felt I should finish my engineering degree, but then get into liberal arts subjects like my master's was in psychology and sociology. And then I went on for a year at the University of Chicago, working in the School of Social Service Administration, where I had planned initially to finish up a PhD program there, but changed my mind and got to work after we had one child and one on the way. So I went out and started to work.
What was the first time you got introduced to the concept of city management?
After the service, I went out to the University of Colorado because they would accept my finishing engineering at the same time taking the undergraduate courses to go into a master's in sociology. At one of our Tau Beta Pi meetings, one of our graduates from University of Colorado was the city manager of Colorado Springs. And he first introduced me to the subject of city management. I put it on back burner because I felt that I still wanted to go in social work and community organization. So that's when I went to Chicago. But at Chicago, I had to, at the university, had to walk every day past the 1313, which was the clearinghouse, public administration clearinghouse, and ICMA, International City Management Association, was one of the organizations in the building. So I used to stop by and talk to Clarence Ridley, who was the director of the ICMA. And when I decided I wanted to get a job, I became a junior member of ICMA and applied for 3 cities. All 3 asked me to interview: Keene, New Hampshire, with Hank Goodnow, Pontiac, Michigan, with George Bean, and Minot, North Dakota, with Jay Bliss. Minot came across right away and offered me a job, and Jay Bliss also said that he wanted to retire in 18 months and that he was looking for a person that would replace him. So we accepted the position in Minot, North Dakota.
So early on, it was a situation where it wasn't just the size of the city or whatever, but it was the person that you would be training with, as much as the
well, it was more
the
type. I felt the type of city.
Can you explain that a little bit, what you mean by type of city?
Well, what you would be doing as the assistant. In Pontiac, they wanted the person, George Bean had 3 assistants, and he wanted one to be in engineering, and I didn't, and that was the only one open. I didn't want to be in the engineering part of it. Jay Bliss in Minot wanted a overall assistant who would be in all phases of the administration.
Can you talk a little bit about how your background at that point in psychology and sociology were feeding into public administration, and how it kind of worked together with your engineering? What were the kinds of skills that you thought you had to offer?
Well, at one time, we asked city managers what they thought was the best undergraduate degree for city management. 1/3 said engineering, 1/3 said business, and 1/3 said social science. When we looked at their pedigrees, 1/3 of the managers were engineers, 1/3 was, so everybody wanted to say that their career path is the best in the thing. But I felt that engineering was very useful in city managers, especially smaller cities. In fact, in early days, most of our city managers were engineers.
But it wasn't an exclusive profession that you thought?
No, that's right.
So can you talk a little bit about that blend with where you were coming from? Not only did you have the engineering, but you had the interest in the social work and sociology and psychology.
Well,
How did that fuel you to be in a position to play a role as a city manager?
but where you could work with people and get to know the organization better.
Okay. Shall we move on to Minot?
Minot.
Okay. I understand it's 1949 when you first go
That's right,
to
yes.
Minot. Before we get into the specifics of the actual position, was that an eye-opening experience to go from the city of Chicago and various other places, Jersey City and so on, to North Dakota?
Minot was quite an experience. As we sat through the coldest we saw it there was one winter, of the 2 winters we were there, was 49 below zero. And the average mean temperature for the month of January each year was about minus 19 degrees. And we saw it as hot in the summertime as 112. But you had 2 seasons. You had July and winter. It was a totally contained city, close to where did a lot of the business through Saskatchewan and through Canada, so it was a metropolitan area for the whole region there in the northwest part of North Dakota. When you see that there were only, today, only 400,000 people in the entire state. Minot was a city of about 30,000, but in the eyes of people, it was the third largest city in the state, and had a lot to offer.
And when you went in, the city manager was looking to retire in a
Yes,
number of
he
years?
had talked about that, but he was a wonderful person, first registered engineer in the state of North Dakota, gave very little direction for what I should do, which surprised me. So I try to fill in where he wasn't working. Like we had a 12-person council, and I was secretary for all the council committees, and there were many, and did the office work, personnel. It came after being there about a year. He said to me, "Bob, you're very popular here with the people, and they like you." I said, "Well, that's nice, but am I respected?" Which was more important to me. And he said, "Well, I wish you had spent more time in the field with the projects, the engineering projects." Well, I said, "I mainly didn't do the engineering projects because this is where you were all the time." So I try to fill in. And I found out that, and later found out when I got to Phoenix, that there has to be a clear definition of what the job should be. And in Minot, there was no clear definition. But I thoroughly enjoyed the time there.
What were some of this was your first experience with responsibility in city management. So you mentioned working with the council and the committees. What other kinds of first experiences did you have there in Minot?
Well, I did work, like we put in parking meters, and then the people voted that they didn't want them, so I had to take them out, and I had to try to sell them. I worked with all departments on getting their budgets together. And I recall our cemetery director all the time used to say that I should have the highest pay in the city because I have more people underneath me than anybody else in the city. And had just a time working, trying to keep the various projects moving along.
I would think working with a 12-member council would be rather a complex task. Was that the case?
It was a trying a time because we had one or two fistfights at council meetings, so this was not a laid-back city council. But it was interesting working with them because there was always a group that were against council manager government. And they never identified it, but I never realized it until I got there. Our mayor, who was friendly with me, was head of the Central Labor Union. He was a barber, but Minot's a big labor city because it's a terminal railhead for several of the major rail lines. And he was anti-Jay Bliss, the city manager.
What was problematic enough that drew people into fistfights?
What's that?
What was so problematic that caused people to have fistfights?
Oh, I don't know. They just had strong feelings on various issues. I don't remember the issues right now.
So in your first experience, did you think you were in the right place? Not meaning Minot, but did you think city management was a good place for you?
Oh, yes.
Right off from the first experience?
Yeah. The interest of trying to get, when you have different opinions and trying to get together and get ideas to gel and get some decisions made.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it was a fascinating field.
So you weren't looking back and questioning that decision as you went on?
No looking back.
Okay. How about in terms of, we're going to talk about 5 or 6 different places you went. So was it a problem to pick up the family and now keep making these moves to serve different cities?
Well,
Was that a decision that you and your wife had to
we
come to
talked
accept?
about all of them. She was very supportive of all the decisions, but these were made jointly as we talked about them.
So let's talk about what led you to leave Minot.
Well,
Did you stay in that position as assistant under
Yeah,
Jay
well,
Blitz the whole time?
Jay Bliss, the manager, who had said he was going to retire in 18 months, and even with the pressures by the council putting on him, he said that he felt healthy and he had nothing else to do, and so he would stay on as city manager indefinitely. The surprising thing is that he never owned a house. He rented an apartment for the whole 18, 19 years he was there. But he encouraged me to buy a house, and we bought a house and then had to sell it. And looking back, he did a great job in Minot in keeping council manager government. When I was there, we had 3 city managers in the state: Minot, Fargo, and Grand Forks. We had a meeting of the League of Cities, and they were announcing where the police chiefs would meet in the Silver Room, the finance directors would meet in the Gold Room, and one of the commissioners from Grand Forks got up and said, "The city managers are going to meet in the telephone booth." And when he sat down, I was right behind him. He said, "I hope we take the telephone booth away." And since that time, the other 2 cities got rid of council manager government, so Minot's the only city in the state. At one of the cities, there was a person by the name of Leroy Hollow, who was really extremely knowledgeable in the public administration field. He headed the Lou Herbert Hoover Commission for the state of Minnesota, and also then later became director of the public administration program at Brigham Young University. But he made the mistake in Fargo of firing the police chief when he was on vacation. And not only did he lose his job, Fargo lost council manager government. So I asked myself, who did the better job in the final analysis in trying to keep continuity? And with all his lack of public administration skills, Jay Bliss had completely honest, straightforward, directly speaking person who you had to respect. But I told him that since he was going to stay on, I would look elsewhere. And the only person I talked to was the city manager, because I wasn't working for the council, only indirectly. I was working for the manager. So I applied and got offered the job in Milton Freewater, Oregon. When it was announced, the council were quite upset. And at the first meeting, by a 7-5 vote, they fired the city manager and appointed me as acting city manager without my knowledge. We both flabbergasted. In North Dakota, under the state law, the manager who was fired has a right to appeal. He appeals to the accusers. The accusers become the judges, but in between you get public opinion. The next day I wrote a letter to them and to the council that under no circumstances would I accept the job as city manager, that I already accepted a job in Milton Freewater and felt I was obliged to take that job. What they did with the other part of the program was up to them to decide. But I had made a decision, and in ethics, I would be remiss if I didn't follow through with the contract.
That's quite a dramatic turn of events.
It was. And after I left, the council backed down. And Jay Bliss stayed on for a couple of years. And then he retired at his own pace, which I was pleased about.
So you were completely unaware of how the council felt about your service.
That's right. Well, I was completely unaware that this would happen, and that whether Jay Bliss had talked to any of them about when he hired me. I was the first and only assistant he ever had, whether it was with that understanding. But from my standpoint, I had not talked except being friendly with the council members. And the surprising thing is that if I had stayed there, the same people that voted to retain Jay Bliss would be the main people I would rely on to be supportives. They were for Jay Bliss, but they were also for council manager government. The people that wanted to fire him could use me as the excuse, but some of them were for me. Some of them might have been just against council manager government. You never know.
Interesting lesson.
But it was a good move, and I enjoyed my time in Minot.
So let's talk about what happens in Milton Freewater.
Milton Freewater was a delightful city. It was two small cities, Milton and Freewater, that there was one barber shop that was half in Milton and half in Freewater. Milton was a very well-to-do city with a strong electric utility. Freewater was a poor stepsister. It required a majority vote of both cities to have the election for that. The Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, and the people from Whitman College made the study that recommended the consolidation. It only passed by one vote.
So, sorry to interrupt. Could you try not to cover your microphone with your hands?
Okay,
We
good.
almost got there. Thank you.
It only passed by one vote in Freewater. And so when I came there, the former city manager had started the program, and I made a decision that two of my goals were that we would have water meters, because people were sprinkling, using this even when it was raining, and have only one fire department rather than the two volunteer departments. When I left 6 years later, we still had no water meters and had two fire departments. With the water meters, the best I got was a councilman told me, Bob, if you make the motion, I will second it to have water meters. And I said, I can't make the motions on that. So, and with the fire departments, these were all volunteers. I used to play pitch with them every month at their meetings. And they just had a night out on town when they could get out, and a great group. But it was much better keeping the two departments together rather than separate. Freewater had a system when I got there where the policemen used to get part of their salary by going to the taverns and getting part of their salary from the slot machine money. we got rid of slot machines right away and worked on the thing. One of the many areas we worked on was that our electric utility had competing lines in free water. Pacific Power and Light had lines on one side of the street, and our city had line, and at times before they consolidated, Milton had to go out and work on the utility at nighttime because the police would try to prevent them from coming in the city to work on the lines. Our rates were about the 7th lowest in the country, and Pacific Power wanted to sell out, so we finally got the city of Freewater, or got Milton Freewater to buy out Pacific Power. Their president sent a letter to all their customers, which was unusual, asking them to vote for the sale. Mm-hmm. And we finally got both Milton and Freewater under the system.
So just let me make sure I understand. You actually created a municipal water system?
Was a municipal line with the, we had a boyhood dream where we had a small generating plant, a small hydro plant, and bought power from Bonneville Power Administration. And we ran power lines 20 miles in the country in some places to feed the chicken farmers that used them for heating their chicken houses.
Mm-hmm.
So you serve the small regional area then?
Yes.
So here you're having experience where strong cultures and traditions are making things continue to stay the same, like in water meters and the things you talked about. So is this your first experience where you're saying that city management, in order to progress, in order to move on, really has to take account of the traditions and strong cultures that are already established in an area? It's not a cookie cutter kind of a thing. You can't make changes in a city where a city doesn't want to make those changes.
Well, I think in general, my philosophy is with change. I look upon change, if my change is just different, I'll leave it alone. If I feel that things that are changing are for the better, I will work towards getting the changes made. Mm-hmm. I recall a philosophy I had where in the service, one first sergeant I knew who was a professional gambler said, "Bob, I size up every situation, and if I think I'm going to give in, I give in. If I don't think I'm going to give in, I fight like hell." And so you just change things that are necessary and don't change just for the sake of change.
Mm-hmm. How did that play out, though, in a situation where you saw the water meters? You perceived that would have been a good educational change and a good financial change for the city, but you were met with resistance on that.
That's, well, if you can't get the council to move, you listen to the council. Mm-hmm. And respect their position on it. We actually could operate a great deal of the city just on the revenue from the electric utility. In fact, when I had been there only 4 months, we had our International City Management meeting in Poland Springs, Maine. And I said to the council, I know I've only been here a short time. I would like to go to the meeting. So they said, "Go, Bob." And the electric utility paid the whole way from on the thing for the trip to ACMA.
What was the main thing that you think you learned, your main experience at Milton Freewater? you mentioned in Minot, maybe it was about, you needed to clarify what exactly was your job, what's your role? What would you say
One of the
about
things
Milton
I
Freewater?
learned is that one of our good friends there was the city attorney. And I think it's important for managers to, and you're fortunate when you have a city attorney, that you can talk with very openly and get not only legal advice from him, but also get personal advice. And I felt that our city attorney there was extremely helpful from the very start. Very good supportive counsel. We had one major tragedy there that we had one daughter born, we had two born when we were at Milton Freewater, but one, when she was 2, started to get, had brain tumors and was, for 2 years we had her in and out of the hospital, 2 major operations, and my wife had to go down to Portland for the hospital there because they couldn't even do it in Walla Walla, Washington. And was very trying, but all the churches in the community had prayer sessions for us, and a very supportive community. We were well accepted, we loved the people, became a part of the community. And at the end, our mayor, Lou Yantis, who was a butcher, started to get ideas about his own philosophy of life. He used to like to play golf and hit the ball and then run to the next ball and then hit the ball and run to the next, and used to brag about beating all the young fellows at golf. The council was worried that he was going a little bit eccentric. And he felt that, well, the city manager has too much power. And he felt that the council should do something about it. And the council were extremely supportive of me. But they were afraid, Bob, they said, we are fearful that the mayor might shoot you someday. So I said, well, that's nice. I talked to Lou Yantis and tried to calm him down, but he was constantly talking about the American way and democracy and all these other things. At that time, my fellow city manager at Pendleton, who was my best friend in city management, and I helped form the Northwest City Managers Association. We formerly just had the Oregon City Managers with a person with Herman Curley. At one of our meetings, Clarence Ridley, the icon of all icons in ICMA, was at our meeting. And I was presiding at a session, and the other 3 speakers did tremendous jobs. And I was supposed to be the last speaker, and I just talked about that a city manager should unpack his bags and live in a community, and related the experiences we had of losing one of our daughters, and how the community was supportive. Whether that made any notion, all of a sudden, about a year later, I got a call from ICMA in Chicago saying, would I be interested in the assistant city manager position? So I flew back to Chicago and was offered the job as assistant director of ICMA. I had known Aaron Noting, who then became director, but not well. I had mainly known Clarence Ridley. So that was finished my tenure when I left Milton Freewater. Many of the people were surprised the night before we left that we had a project going at church of painting 2 of the offices. And I was out that night painting with them before we left early the next morning, because we felt a real strong tie to the people there.
So you were not only by that time learning how to be a city manager, but you'd already become a leader.
Yes, we had built up a lot of friendships that we learned a lot from.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned before that in your first job you were happy that people liked you, but you wanted to know whether they respected you. And is that what you came to learn by the time you left Milton Freeman?
Yes, yeah.
That there was something about you as a person and your abilities as a manager that would bring people to respect you?
I think I was well respected in the community. And in a small community, you have to be a jack of all trades and be everything to everybody. Managing in a small city is possibly harder than a large city because you don't have the help to do all these things. And like I used to go out at nighttime with when we had a broken water main, and we had to wait for hours to let the water drain out before the crew could work. I would sit down with them, and they could tell jokes by the hour. And I just worked with them. As I said, with the fire departments, I played pitch. One of the interesting things was Milton Freewater grew from a city of about 4,000 to around 10,000 during the pea season. We were called the pea capital of the world. And we froze and canned peas at about 4 or 5 canneries we had in town. So we had a ministry to migrants, and I worked with the Council of Churches and the ministry to bring youth into the city to work with the Migrant Center. And I was president of the Council of Churches for a year, and we got a house for recreation for the migrants, and each one of the churches picked a room to repair in the place.
So Milton Freewater was a lot smaller.
Was that?
These cities were a lot smaller than Elgin, that you worked along.
Yes, it was a small, delightful city.
What was the, to move to ICMA as the assistant director, now you're going into a completely different kind of situation. But you had some inkling about what went on at ICMA in an intimate way, because
I had
long ago
visited office during my time when I was at the university.
Yeah. So what kind of role was assistant director of ICMA? And how was that different from the kind of experience you had working for a city?
Well, we got our first view of that thing when we formed the Northwest City Managers Association, and I was the first secretary-treasurer, and we conducted, and with Ray Botch, my buddy from Pendleton, was the president, and we had to organize the meetings and do some of the things that on a smaller scale you'd be doing at ICMA.
Mm-hmm. Can you remember some of the sessions and some of the training, and what were some of the issues that that would have been vital at the Northwest, was it called Northwest or Northwestern?
Northwest.
City Manager Association?
The Northwest was Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, mainly.
What were some of the, this is 1950 to 1956, in that period?
We just had meetings. We didn't do anything jointly, except having the annual meeting together, and getting the speakers and getting the programs together.
Anything special you can remember that were important, vital issues for city managers in that period?
Survival, how to get along with the council, how do you relate to the public, things of this type.
Okay.
Now this encompasses really a broader region of the Northwest than you mentioned. It includes Alberta as well, as I remember, and Idaho. It's a big area. How many city manager forms of government were in that area? How big was the association that you're talking about that you formed?
Well, I would say not big, maybe. It encompassed, we had about 80 or 90 council manager cities. And Oregon had the strongest number of city managers. Then Washington and British Columbia had a few. Idaho just had one or two, Pocatello and places like that.
So Oregon's a really important focal point then. Of
Oregon was the focal point, yes.
Okay, so let's move on to ICMA, and you take, so again, you're picking up the family and
Again, take the family.
moving to Chicago. Do you move into that position thinking that it's, what made you think that that would be a good next step for you?
I thought it would be an exciting change and a challenge, because I had attended every national meeting of ICMA. In fact, I attended the first 25 or 30 without missing a year. But again, got to know more about association by going to the annual meetings.
So you were flattered then to be offered this position?
I was honored to be asked without applying to become the assistant director. I'm sure they had asked one or two people before me. They never told me, but I was still flattered by the people that I think were asked that they turned it down. I would have been just flattered that I was in that class.
And who was the director at that point of ICMA?
Well, Clarence Ridley was still the director when I came in May of 1956. But Aaron Noting, his assistant, was going to become director on July 1. Clarence and Audley and Aaron were an interesting group. Clarence was the outside man and Aaron the inside man. Clarence had his doctor's degree, but he acted like he was downplayed himself, and he had a knack of giving disorganized talks. He was loved by the city managers. He just had that ability to relate. Aaron was more the researcher, the writer, difficult to work with, but over the years became the strong person that got ICMA to become an international organization. He was especially respected by the Staat and Oberstadt directors in Germany. That became part of our association. And one of his major contributions was, I think, getting the association to become more international.
Do you want to, can we show the photograph that you brought along of the ICMA members? Okay.
That was
And
the
this is-
entire ICMA staff.
Is this Clarence here?
That's Clarence there,
And which one's Orrin?
behind, right by next to me. I'm the second
Here.
row. No, over
Here.
here. That's, and then I'm the taller one.
Okay. So this is what year?
This was May 1956.
Okay. So when you first arrived.
Yes.
Had Clarence had, how had he become the director of ICMA? Did he have a lot of practical experience in city management, or did he come at it from more the academic side?
Clarence was a city manager, I think it was Bluefield, West Virginia, and had some city manager experience. Orrin was, they both were from the Maxwell School at the University of Syracuse, and had public administration training. During the early days, as we mentioned, when budgets were tight, they had to go into their own pocket at times to make payroll during the very early days. And they carried the organization along. And at that time, several things happened. Our director of training was a fellow by the name of Doug Wyford, who didn't like association work. He found out. He had been assistant at Norfolk, Virginia, and left, and eventually became city manager of Anchorage, Alaska, and Riverside, California. We hired a person by the name of Jeff DeCaro from Xenia, Ohio, as director of training. And Jeff had a doctor's degree, one of the unusual things for a city manager. And again, after a while, didn't like association work. And Jeff and I wrote a book called Management Practices for City Managers in Smaller Cities. And when he left, Orrin asked me to take over as director of training also. My major jobs up to that time were to operate the office and to be in charge of running conferences and just doing whatever else I was assigned to do. Mm-hmm. Another interesting person in this picture was, in ICMA, was a person by the name of Selden Kent, who was one of our assistants. Selden left, and eventually we got together again when I came to Phoenix as a deputy city manager. He was a deputy city manager here in Phoenix. So from meeting in 1956 and then again meeting in 1977 was quite interesting.
This looks like a rather large staff pictured. How big is ICMA at this time? Do you know?
I wish I knew.
Remember?
In the 100 or so, I guess. It's a fairly big staff now.
Right.
So you had a fairly clear set of jobs and roles at ICMA.
Yes.
Clearly
I was
delineated.
very lucky to get to become the, along with my other jobs, director of training, because we had some exciting assignments, I think. The first one, and again, it was good for us to have the University of Chicago. We were 1313 on the East 60th Street on the Plaisance, and the university was right across the street. And we got strong ties with the University of Chicago, in their Center for Public Administration. And we ran our first 2 advanced management training programs. We had 80 city managers for a week, and we got the leading public administration professors from throughout the country to be discussion leaders and speakers for the program. We had the first 2, and then I left after 61, and for some reason they didn't follow through on additional advanced management programs after that. Maybe part of it was one that we got some of the financing through the University of Chicago. Another program we worked on with the university was, at that time, Chicago was going through a major police scandal.
A police?
Police scandal in the city of Chicago. The policemen had their own warehouse where they would take stolen goods, television sets, you name it, and would sell them from the warehouse, among other things. Chicago brought in Orlando Wilson, who was a professor of criminology at the University of California at Berkeley, to become superintendent of police. Orlando asked that the center at University of Chicago and ICMA to have a 1-week training course for all 1,300 sergeants and 600 lieutenants and captains within 6 months. I worked and wrote the syllabus for the sergeants program and ran 2 of the groups we had 40 in each group, and ran 2 of the groups myself. And we called in police chiefs from throughout the country to have leadings in there, like the city manager, the police chief from Tucson, Bernie Garmeyer, was one of our leaders for a week. The thing I try to do, and found out from this thing that we found out, that the sergeants in Chicago did not feel they were management. They were just patrolmen with special privileges. And I try to sell the idea, why didn't you do anything when these things were happening? And I used the example of the brainwashing of the American soldiers in the Korean War. And a psychiatrist on there was asking the question, how come American soldiers got brainwashed so fast in Korean War? And there was one example of a compound where there were 40 American prisoners, and one of the prisoners got a bad case of diarrhea, and two of the bullies kicked him out, and he died of exposure. Now, the psychiatrist wasn't concerned about the bullies, because you're always going to have bullies. He was concerned about the 37 that did nothing. And I asked him, you did nothing. And if you have a bad apple, you have to get rid of this idea of keeping all your problems to yourself and never squeal, never tattletale, never clean house externally. So we try to work on that, and this was a great experience for me. At the same time as I taught at the University of Chicago Downtown Center and at Loyola and Roseville for the 5 years in graduate and undergraduate courses in public administration, which was very helpful for me. And also had my buddy again from Pendleton, Oregon at that time became city manager of Elgin, Illinois. And he asked me to take training courses for his department heads in Elgin. So I would go out on Friday evenings and teach public works administration, techniques of administration, what we call our Green Books series. And the person that met me the first year at the train depot was Marvin Andrews. Marvin Andrews was the intern at that time at Elgin, and shortly after that, he left Elgin before I even came to go to Phoenix as an assistant or an intern here in Phoenix, and to work us up through the ladder of the thing. But Marvin was well accepted in Elgin. So that
It's
was
interesting. It's like it's not degrees of separation in the world of city management. It's like 2 degrees of separation. It's a family.
Now, let me follow through on the thing. Again, I was happy and a little bit frustrated at times. Arn was difficult because he would pick on minor things to do, and minor things irritated him. Like at one time, he didn't like one of the secretaries that was doing some things he didn't like. And on Friday morning, he called me in and asked me to fire that secretary by Friday afternoon, which I had no other choice to do but to get her to go. Another time, he called the office manager and me into the office and was concerned about the mail clerk was taking foreign stamps off of envelopes. It wasn't that she couldn't take them off, but she'd take the envelopes and tear them off on her own time. But as I said, and overall, I respected him and looked as a buffer between me and the staff as some minor things that irritated him. Mm-hmm. In late 1961, my friend and buddy, Ray Botch, we had been together at Milton Free Water in Pendleton, was city manager at that time in Elgin. And he said, Bob, Elgin's looking for a new city manager. You ought to apply for the job. Now, at the same time, I found out the city employees that I had been working with on Friday evenings were asking the council about me. And the council were not happy, so they asked me to come over for an interview. And we went over, and they offered me the job as city manager of Elgin, which I accepted. I mentioned this to Arn, sent him a letter saying I was resigning to go to Elgin. He offered me more money to try to stay. And again, I said, no, I've accepted the job there. So I went over about a little bit less than 2 years later. He asked me to come back as associate director to head up a Washington, D.C. office. I looked through my notes and wrote him a letter saying that I was flattered again, but had only been in Elgin 2 years, and it had been unfair at that time to accept the job. In the meantime, a year later, there was an assistant that I never knew by the name of Bob Brown who became assistant director. And he came out to Elgin to ask me to be part of a movement to get Aaron Knowlton to retire. I told him I wanted no part of it, and that if he felt this way, he should resign and work from the outside in trying to do this. How long? I'd never followed the system through after that. So, one of the little interesting things, how frugal Arn was. After I left in January 1, 1962, we had our next conference in San Francisco, and when I got there, Arn recognized that we didn't have enough staff, and he asked me to, if I
mean in
would
Elgin? You didn't have enough staff?
operate the desk and the front part and the start of the conference for all of Sunday and Monday morning. And so I said fine on the thing.
So your psychology must have, your understanding of people
Yeah.
must have really
The
been an
last thing,
important component.
when Arn finally, I think he retired, I think, in 1967. I think it was. I was at a meeting at a conference in Las Vegas with our mayor at a public works convention, and one of the board members from ICMA came over there and asked me if I would be interested in the director's job. I said, well, I've been now at Elgin 5 years, and I would like to consider it. I would like to be interviewed. He assured me that the board would interview me. The next thing I heard, Mark Keene was appointed city director of the association. I felt sad that maybe he forgot, but that the assurance that was given to me. But I felt glad that we got a super person as director. So, and also, by staying in my own career, made some wonderful friends over the years that I would have missed if I had changed the system. So the only thing that irritated me was that the person told me this and then didn't follow through. But that's part of life.
We should talk about the publications before we move on.
Yeah, before we move away from your experience at ICMA, you brought along a couple of publications. So tell us just generally about how ICMA was actually publishing these materials, and we see that they've been translated into other languages.
I left out another interesting assignment we had. The municipal manpower asked us to run a survey of in-service training throughout the country, and they contract with ICMA to make this thing. Our assistant took the East Coast and I took the West Coast of visiting the major cities and talking about in-service training, and fed this information to Arn, who we all together put together. I have a copy, but didn't bring it with me, of the in-service training that was going on in the country.
Not this one?
No, this was just made because of yes. But that was not the report to Manpower Commission, which was
Okay.
about a 200-page report
Okay.
with a lot of exhibits in it. So I wrote several books, the internship training for city management. I have another one, the role of the assistant to the city manager, and then a manual for municipal training, which was also published in Vietnamese for the
And we have that.
when the Vietnam War was going on.
And then you also wrote this book, Management Practices for Smaller Cities, which
Yes.
is, now is this part of the Green series that you talked about?
That's part of the Green series.
Okay, so there were a whole series of substantial
We had
books.
about, we had about 10 books in the series.
Okay. Was this the first one?
This was the first one on management practices. And for some reason, it was never republished.
But that was published in, what's the date on that?
1962
Well, it's copyrighted 1959, but
59.
But you only got there in May of 1959. So this was one of the first things you
One of
worked
the first
on.
things we did, yes.
Okay.
we came in 56.
Oh, okay. Sorry, 56. Okay.
And this is the one you wrote with Chip? Is that right? Chip the Carell?
What's that?
This was co-authored with Chip, who you talked
Jeff
about?
DeCaro.
Right.
He's the one that stayed just, and then resigned shortly after that.
Okay.
Okay.
Just following through with city managers, a number of things I did after that. I got the Distinguished Service Award sometime in the 60s. I was for 3 years on the advisory committee for the Office of Economic Opportunities. Had a very interesting task force, 2 city managers, 2 mayors, 2 governors, 2 Indian chiefs. Went back to Washington 4 times a year to talk with and advise the OEO. Those was in the days of the war on poverty. To work with the staff on various problems in Georgia. Jerry Fox, the city manager from Texas, was the other city manager with me on that task force, which was an interesting assignment.
What came of that commission and that work?
I think it was Nixon. It became killed. It was all the good things that were being done were destroyed to a large degree. Not destroyed, but slowed down because of things. And we all, when we got a director who was really anti, most of us on the board resigned almost immediately on the advisory committee.
When what happened?
It
You all
went out of
resigned
ex-
when?
It went out of existence then.
Okay.
Can you tell us, can we go back to the publications for just a second?
Okay.
Just to be clear about this, were these produced and written because nothing else was available at the time and ICMA was stepping in to provide training and to do this kind of thing? This is a substantial book and this is a substantial series then.
Green books have been a long-standing tradition with ICMA. Library administration, public health administration, techniques of administration, supervisory methods, was extremely big part of it. Dave Arnold, who was our publication director of ICMA, an excellent editor, stayed with them for years, finally, before he retired, became an honorary member since he couldn't get life membership because he'd never been a city manager. Pretty much did the editing on this work. I edited 2 or 3 of them, one on library administration, worked with the Library Association. And the Green Books are a big part of the history that Clarence and Oren started and worked with over the years.
So in the late 50s when these start then, these were really pioneering.
This one was
Was
pioneering,
pioneering.
but they had been going on for a long
Okay.
time.
All right.
This was just added to the mix.
Added to the mix, okay.
One of the other interesting things, back in the 70s, I was elected regional vice president from ICMA, and served my 2 years. When I got off the board, the person who had been the second person on with me, Joe Warren from Jackson, Michigan, was fired by a city council in Jackson. A very unusual firing, a sad one. Joe, one of the nicest, sweetest guys you ever met. On Mother's Day, the mayor called him and said, "Joe, we're having a special council meeting down at City Hall. Will you please come?" He got there and they said, "Joe, we want you to resign. If not, we're going to fire you." we give you 30 minutes to think it over. Joe resigned but got a year's severance out of it. Mark Keene called me and asked me to serve his unexpired term since I had just got off the board. I called Joe and said, Joe, I said, I like being on the board, but not this way. And I said, so we, and that destroyed Joe Warren and the field because he had done tremendous work in Michigan managers. This is the way that some city councils work on things, and you have to expect that at times. One of the interesting things, at one of our board meetings, and I related this when I wrote a letter for the 80th birthday of one other city manager who had followed me at Milton Freewater, but then was on the board with me at ICMA. If I knew any comical thing about that, we had sat through a whole afternoon of meetings. We talked, the Committee on International Management, the young managers, the women in management, the minorities in management, and all these reports. So Gene Kastner said, I hope we have a report on us dirty old men in management, just to say that work with also the mainstream of your managers. All these other things are good. But you also have to remember the bread and butter.
Right. We're going to move on and talk about Elgin. Did you want to take a break at all?
Might be good to take a break for a second.
Okay. We'll do that. It's 1962. We have a ways to go. Did you want to get up and walk around, or?
It's northwest. It's on the way to Madison, Wisconsin.
How many miles from Chicago?
From downtown Chicago, about 40.
Oh, okay.
So it's not contiguous? Then.
What?
Is it contiguous? Is it right next to Chicago?
Right next to Chicago.
Okay, so
It's
just...
closer to O'Hare Field.
Oh, okay. Sure.
We are recording.
Okay, let's take us to 1962, and you're moving into the position of city manager in Elgin, Illinois.
In Elgin, I followed a great city manager, Ray Botch, who had been there. Like many places, different managers served different roles in a city. Ray Botch, the first real city manager for Elgin, did a great job on organizing, getting the finances in shape, and starting an urban renewal project, which made my job easier. The first thing we worked on was a major urban renewal program and built a civic center where we put in a new city hall, a new library, Hemmons Auditorium. One woman left us $2.5 million, and an appellate court and a post office that I almost immediately started to work on. I had to get the urban renewal part finished first, but I'm thankful that I had Ray Botch before me to work on some of this stuff. In Elgin, we had an interesting, and you could almost write a book on different mayors. But the first mayor, when I came there, Leroy Moat, was the corporation counsel and secretary of the Elgin Watch Company. The second mayor was a truck driver and a member of the Teamsters Union. The third manager was Mike Alft, who had graduated magna cum laude from Grinnell, had his master's from Maxwell School and a PhD in social science. And the last one was a businessman. So you as a manager have to make the adjustment to them. Clyde Shales, as mayor, was part of the government that charter against city manager government. But Clyde, like me, and I kept on telling Clyde, as he said, Bob, you and I don't like city management government. I said, you can't sink the ship and save the captain. The captain has to go down with the ship. But except for the last mayor, I got along very well with all these people in the city. Another interesting thing is that had a strong tie after a while with Northern Illinois University and Jim Banovitz, who I believe is still there at NIU, and his public administration program, and had various interns. And I had some great assistants over the years. One of the first ones, Bob Mom, stayed with the city 30 years. And still with the city, and is now president of the group called Group to Retain Council Manager Government in Elgin. Another one, Jim Grisma, now is the Dean of Business at the University of Denver. Another one, Steve Burley, retired and is a range rider for Illinois. Another one, Larry Asaro, went to Prescott, and unfortunately, after being in Prescott only about a year, died. But these were among the 14 or 15 I was fortunate to have, and fortunate having NIU and having the chance to work all these young people and get 14 or 15 started on the path of being city managers or in other parts of the career.
What was the mechanism to have interns? What was the mechanism that brought interns into Elgin?
Well, I knew that the workload was getting heavier, and that if I had to do all the other duties, and meeting with the council and things, we needed extra people to do it. And so this became the mechanism for working on that.
Where did you recruit them from? Because one thing we didn't talk about was the internship program at ICMA.
Well,
How did you actually get them?
Had a built-in system with NIU having training assistants, and except for about one, they all came through NIU program. The one that didn't, a person by the name of Jim Spohr, who went to the University of Illinois and got his 5-year degree in planning and then a master's degree in planning. And I kept the job open for him while he did his military service and became an assistant and community development director. Now is the city manager of Virginia Beach, which is the largest council manager city in the state of Virginia, as one of my really excellent, well, they all were excellent, but it was fun seeing them grow and develop.
Did they work directly with you? Were they working in your office? Is this where they were doing the intern work?
Sometimes they acted as, they worked in my office. Sometimes they acted in did purchasing, did personnel work. And
did you work closely with a majority of them?
yes, very closely. In fact, I would have coffee or breakfast with them when they were there, like once a week, to just discuss the affairs of the week going on, and had very close contact with the assistants.
So you worked as a strong mentor then with them?
Was that?
You worked as a strong mentor with
Yes.
them?
What were some of the characteristics? You must have been able to identify the kind of characteristics that you thought would make a good intern grow into a good city manager. What were you looking for?
Well, the first thing is to be able to get the job done and to relate well with people. I don't, the public can't tell how good a job you're doing in many areas. And they will evaluate the city on the basis of how courteous your people are, how clean your streets are, how well the lawns are mowed. They say if you do all these superficial things well, you must be doing other things well. So you're looking for people who could get along well with the public, get along well with the employees. I had some other interesting employees there. One of the most interesting ones about last year, about March of, about 9 months ago, I had a call from a person and said, Mr. Brunton, this is Glenn Traub. I just got my 40-year pin with the city of Elgin. You hired me. He said, out of high school, as the mail clerk, you offered me $1.60 an hour, but I got $1.70 an hour, and I'm still here, still doing almost the same work. And I said, Glenn, this is the best hiring I ever did. It was really pleasing to hear from him this way. Our city clerk, who I got along with after a while, was a spinster, and she, after we got friendly with each other, she said, well, the worst thing that happened to me is I was valedictorian, and the boys all stayed away from me. And she would say, she said one time, Mr. Brunton, I thought for the first 2 years you were here, you were a crook. She said, because you were always helping the developers. And I said, I gradually began to realize that you didn't like red tape and try to get as quickly as possible things done. She had lots of other things, like we used to talk all the time. She had a philosophy, they ought to send only the old men to war because save the young men for the future and the war wouldn't last as long. So over and over again we talked about all these and had a very happy, friendly relationship with all the employees there. Some sad things. When our city engineer committed suicide, and I had to give at the church service, the program about him and the great things he had done. But these are the things you live with.
Did you want to say more about Elgin?
The Elgin Watch Company was leaving Phoenix. Elgin Watch Company was Phoenix for a while.
You mean
Elgin?
Elgin.
In Elgin. It was the national headquarters, the big factory. They were going to leave. They finally said they're going to leave. They did. They went down to Blaney, South Carolina, got South Carolina to change the name to Elgin, South Carolina. Lasted 2 years and then left because the watch business, except for assembling, was done by cheaper labor other places. We were strong enough and built up enough of an economic base that we were able to survive, not only survive, but to thrive. At first, I tried to get the old Elgin Watch Building and plant to be taken over by Judson College. Judson College was a strong college in Chicago that was leaving Chicago. They were going to keep their seminary there, but kept their seminary in Chicago, but wanted to move. They found out it wasn't acceptable, so they finally built and have their campus, and a very excellent campus along the Fox River in Elgin now, and is been growing by leaps and bounds as a good small college in our country.
So what did become of the Elgin property?
It became, to a large degree, a supermarket was there. The two overriding issues in Elgin over the years were police and housing. When our old chief retired or left, we had to appoint a new chief. The city charter in Elgin says that department heads are appointed with the advice and consent of the city council. Now, advice and consent to the average department head means, Bob, get the most qualified person for the job. But the police department is, Bob, we want to be involved. We had two final candidates, a lieutenant who was laid back but extremely competent, and a sergeant who was by far the most popular person on the force. I leaned towards the lieutenant, but found out that the council would not confirm, would not go along with it, and rather than having a knockdown, drag-out fight, had the sergeant take the job. Very fine person, but what I found out from working with the Chicago Police Department, he couldn't cut the ties with the people in the city, with the police department, as well as we went to various meetings together. We went down to South Bend together for Notre Dame games. He was a strong Notre Dame fan. We attended a week seminar on sensitivity training where there were 24 mayor or managers and police chiefs and 24 Black Panthers locked in a room for 1 week. I could have a long story on that, how most of the people left, but we stayed with the Black Panthers. And about the 4th day, after they stopped yelling at us, we started to get a few things accomplished. But I went with the chief every morning to Mass. Even though I'm not Catholic, I found out he had an alcohol problem that I didn't sense soon enough, and in the final analysis, it was continual feuding with several of the policemen. One of them, who was his best buddy, now became his enemy, but got on the city council. So this caused problems in that area. That was overriding the whole issue. The other area was public housing. Well, no problem in getting low and high rise for elderly. But when we tried to get housing for the low-income families on scattered site, rather than having Chicago ghettos built up in public housing, we wanted to build it and scattered throughout the city. One of our major churches in town, the Church of the Brethren, which national headquarters is in Elgin, used to buy houses and then sell them to minorities. In one case, we had a cross burning in front of one of the houses, and so the minister of the church I go to and I went to every house in the neighborhood and talked to them and diffused the situation over a period of 2 or 3 months. And then when we put in housing on the west side of the city, there were open rebellion, and we had several meetings in the gymnasium at the high school. The council delegated me to go. They didn't want to go. I felt like the Christians being fed to the lions. Helped the situation. One of the major CEOs in town wrote a long letter to the editor saying, they say if we have public housing in scattered sites, our housing values will go down. I don't think it will. but if it does, it's a small price to pay. They say our education will be inferior if we let them in. I don't think it will, but if it does, it's a small price to pay. And this large article helped diffuse the situation. But this was overriding on the, throughout the rest of my time in Elgin. I was possibly too strong in Elgin as I look back. In fact, when I left, a group wanted me to become president of the or director of the Chamber of Commerce. Not willingly that I do this, but I felt that to work with the people, a manager has to fill in the voids and the vacuum that's being left if you don't have the leadership in some areas.
And you had served, I think you mentioned at least 4 mayors, so there's a lot of turnover, and you're the continuity.
Another interesting thing was during my time, this was the burning periods when the blacks were trying to burn cities down. We had our curfews. We had to close both of our high schools. Had to have a curfew in the city. I finally, the mayor at that time was going berserk. This was Mayor Alf, the PhD. And I finally had to ask him and the council to leave City Hall, and in a nice way. I try to be nice, but they were causing more problems. I said, if you want protection, we'll give you protection. We'll keep an open line to keep you informed. We got through the situation fairly well then.
So you were in quite a few positions where you not only had to diffuse things, but you had to serve as a leader,
Yes.
to find your way out of.
And that's the thing when you is the problem in not having a strong leader who will face up to every situation. You'd like to have a mayor, and I learned a lot when we get to Phoenix about trying, and we all try to take a position where the mayor will be taking leadership, except you have the real problem that this government is called, if you use the public administration terms, it's a weak mayor, strong council manager form. And that becomes the dilemma, that the council is the strong body, not the mayor. I recall back years ago when we had the town meetings of the year, and they had a debate between Perry Cookingham from Kansas City, who had trained over 70 people had become city managers under Perry at Kansas City. He cleaned out the Pendergrass machine, and was one of our icons. Had a debate with Joe Clark, who had been mayor of Philadelphia and then U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, on the council manager plan. And Joe Clark, the one thing that I remember, they had a managing director in Philadelphia who reported to the mayor. He said, I want my administrator to be on tap, not on top, which is the way of putting it, that how do you become a strong manager and yet let the council be the strong body? And that's the art that you have to continually work with.
Okay, in the interest of time, shall we move to...
Let me talk about police chief for a while, a little more. After the council got unhappy with Jim Hansen, and I found out he had an alcohol problem, which I didn't sense at first, and I should have. And after I had finally, reluctantly, had to ask him to resign, I got the council to agree to hire a consulting firm to appoint the new chief. And this firm went out and finally came in and recommended a sheriff from a county in Wisconsin. And I said, now, have you checked all bases? And I want you to go up there and make sure there's no skeletons in the closet. And they assured me there weren't. After he was appointed, there was a big article in their papers that he was up before the grand jury. And it turned out the council were in an uproar. And I said, let's find out about it. And in about a month, I found out that he had nothing to do with it. And he was just got caught in the web of a grand jury looking at something else. But the council responds right away. Mm-hmm. And were up in arms all the time on the situation. When they, there were lots of irritating things that the council had. The housing, which they considered me too liberal. The place thing issues. The position of being in the community. And then minor things were starting to irritate them. We didn't take enough time about a squirrel that was rabid, and we should have had acted faster. Didn't take care enough to save the locker room at one of the swimming pools. And all these little things were building up. Finally, went to a meeting one night, a closed meeting, and the mayor gave me a little note that said, Bob, the city council would like you to resign. I said, okay. I went around the room and talked to each one personally, and they all said yes. One of them resigned and left the council. The old policeman was on there, and his big thing was, Bob, you're too much in community affairs here. And I finally said, well, I recognize the right of the council to hire and fire managers. And for any reason, I said, I will have the resignation to you in 2 days. I wrote a letter saying that I hereby resign effective August 31st, which was 2.5 months later, because I said I have these projects I'd like to work with. I had enough strength in the community that the council couldn't say, well, 2.5 months is too long. But they went along with it. And surprisingly, 2 of the 3 of the councilmen that voted for the thing after I was leaving say, I was surprised how much you did and tried to do before you left on the thing. So anyway, when I was leaving, the people had a going away dinner for me, and they had to turn people away at 500 was the maximum they could get into the room there. And we had a going away party, and I had my buddy city manager at that time from Skokie, Illinois, Bob Epley, who was one of the original quartet people with ACMA, to sing the Impossible Dream. And at the same time, I was looking for another job and went to Fort Collins and interviewed there. They tentatively said, yes, but we'd like to go, and I told them about what was happening in Elgin. The entire city council, all 7 of them, came down to Phoenix, down to Elgin, and did different assignments and asking people about me. Some of them asked the businessmen, some went to see the garbage collectors. The garbage collectors were great, because I had a rap session with them every quarter, and when I left, they gave me the what they thought was prized, the old Playboy magazines that they had collected as garbage collectors. And the one council member from Fort Collins said, Bob, I would have thought these people were your brothers the way they talked about you. So anyway, the council were able to be satisfied that managers come and go, and they accepted me at Fort Collins as city manager. So that ended my long 10.5 years at Elgin, which was delightful. All of our children graduated from Elgin High School, and it was a great place to raise a family.
What was the main, do you think, the main learning experience that you had at Elgin that again served you in Fort Collins and Phoenix? Was it a combination of the literally?
I think that a combination of trying to take a lower profile, delegating more, and not work as long hours as I did. Nobody gives you any credit for working long hours. They just think you possibly can't get your work done in a 40-hour week. But those were the three things that I think I primarily learned.
Okay.
And keep calm.
Okay, so we'll move on to Fort Collins. So it's 10.5, it's 1972.
Okay. Tom Coffey was the city manager before me at Fort Collins. He had, I don't know how he got the job. The council liked him, and I liked him. But he had been owning a trucking company and his main claim to fame was that he for years told Jimmy Hoffa to go to hell as he tried to organize his employees. He was although the council thought he was doing a good job, the public did not. The public passed a referendum. It was two parts. One, that the city manager had to stand for vote of confidence every 6 years. Not the manager himself, but the whole system. And the second thing, managers had to retire at 65. So they passed both of them.
Was that common for
No.
a vote of confidence in city manager form of government?
No, that this was except I only knew of one other city that ever had this. And before I left, the best thing I did in Fort Collins, one of the best things, was to get rid of it. But the only other place I knew was at San Jose, California had it. Because all is said, and I had to stand after I'd been there only about 3 years, because the 6 years were up then. And it was, should Robert L. Brunton be retained as city manager? Yes or no? And I got 71% of the vote. I should have got 100% in my book, and couldn't run for office, couldn't do much. When I was running for office, the only thing I did, some of my friends passed a full-page ad in the paper.
Read that.
One of the former mayors that I worked with, Jack Russell, was running for office. And he said to me, Bob, he said, you know, you and I are running for office. And I said, Jack, I feel like the story of the chicken and the pig. The chicken and the pig are walking down a road, and they say a starving family. And the chicken says to the pig, we ought to feed them. We ought to give them a ham and egg dinner. And the pig thought about it and said, you know, what's a contribution from you is total commitment for me. And I said, I feel like the pig with the total commitment, because the city council would be mandated to fire you if you did that. But they can also fire you the day before and the day after. So it didn't make sense.
Was it clear to the public that they were voting on the council manager form of government? Because it seems like it's a vote of confidence in the city manager.
No, they were not voting on the council manager government. They were voting on, this was because of Tom Coffey. They were voting on the manager per se. Nothing to do with, council manager government would continue.
Oh, so it was specifically on
It was specifically on the person.
Okay.
Very
Wow.
unusual.
How did you, you said you got rid of that by the time
Yes.
you left. How did you do that?
Well, I talked with the council and finally got the council to put up, like have one of our elections, that this doesn't make sense. And they agreed with me. But when I got to Fort Collins, Tom Coffey had more of a laissez-faire attitude towards the city staff. Found problems with several of our better department heads. Again, we had, like I did in Milton Field Water, we had a big electric utility in Fort Collins. And the director of that thing was a pillar in the community, extremely able, but felt he was better than the rest of the city employees. They felt that not only he, but the whole electric utility, and to a certain degree that's true. Our electric utility employees got less than their counterparts in the utility profession, but it got the other employees to get more than their counterparts in other things, because you had to keep this. But I found out little things like he would have his own policy that I didn't know about at first, that if they had to travel by plane more than 1 hour, they went first class. And nobody else in the city went first class, including the city manager. So we cut that out and had to cut out a lot of things. And took a long time in getting him, and never got completely in the thing. The council, the mayor was elected by the council, not a direct election. The first mayor I had was from a city manager's position, almost a dream. He, great talker, loved to talk to great public, protected the manager, protected the city council from getting into the administration, hard on the city council because he didn't work with them as much as the other part of it. One of the many things I had problems there with this Carl Carson, to give you an idea of the difficult nature of sometimes city management. We had a very prestigious firm in Fort Collins that was Woodward Governor. They make governors, major headquarters, national headquarters in Rockford, Illinois. They had a big campus. When I say campus, they're buildings with landscaping and all sorts of amenities. Very conservative. They would hire people out of high school, had their own barber there so the boys would get their haircut. They would have American First lectures for them and things of this type. Did a great deal of community work in landscaping, the hospital and the library and things like this. They were completely surrounded by the city. And Carl Carson said to me, Bob, before I leave office, I think they ought to come in the city. I said, okay. I went to their manager and said, would you come in the city limits? His answer was, hell no. Carl Carson said to me, Bob, we would like to see them in the city. They were putting addition on. They could get the water and sewer by just extending it on their campus without, illegally, but without approval. But they needed another transformer. And we had to move that transformer in by the electric utility, and we wouldn't move the transformer until they signed up. The manager went down, up and down College Avenue to the merchants and saying, we're thinking of moving back to Rockford, Illinois because of what the city's doing to us, to try to get them up. They sent a letter to their employees saying, you're not going to get a bonus this Christmas because of this. And they finally put one of their executives elected to the city council to get rid of me. All because I followed the mayor's instructions and did what I was supposed to do. Another time we had an industry coming in town, Hewlett Packard came to me and said, Bob, would like to move to Fort Collins. We need about 50 to 100 acres. We need a big campus. And if anybody finds out about this, the land values go so high that we can't do anything. So we don't want you to talk to anybody about it. I said, well, I want to talk to one person, the mayor. They said, okay, so I had the mayor, who was that time Jack Russell, appraised him of the situation. We kept quiet, we finally got assembled. And then finally, when they went before the zoning board, it felt like the mayor and manager were on trial rather than the company, because we did this without talking with them before time. And we tried to explain that we were doing this to safeguard the system. But it's another one of the life's trials and tribulations you have as a manager.
What was the system at that time?
What was that?
What was the system at that time in Fort Collins for business development? How would it have progressed if you hadn't helped HP to find this property? How did the city usually assist and attract new businesses?
Well, we were doing very well, but it was on the outskirts of the city, coming into the city. And we would have survived without it, but it was something that the city needed for eventual growth.
Was there a lot of annexation happening in
Yes,
Fort Collins at that time?
a lot of growth.
Did it involve incentives in any way at that period?
Didn't what?
Did it involve incentives?
No incentives.
That
No,
didn't
we
really
were
exist
lucky
yet.
that I think what we've been doing now is almost criminal in making incentives to its developers. And cities should try to get together and say, only being hurt by this is not is the citizens in the city, not the developers, in doing this. But that's a different
That was
story.
before that time, okay.
Another thing that happened, I had some police studies made in when I was in Elgin. They had made studies for Kane County, and we were in Cook County. We were partially in Cook County where they made the study for their county, and I asked them to make a police study for Collins. One of the many things recommendation they made, we did quite a few little things, but they asked us to, or suggested that we give each patrolman a squad car to take home and use privately to get better exposure of squad cars, because they found out when squad cars were on the streets, people drove slower and more carefully. We tried this for a while. But then we asked for a reconnaissance study the council one. And in the reconnaissance study, I would not recommend, unless they understand, because you're trying to say, what are we doing wrong and can we do better? They don't talk about what you're doing well. They talk about what you can do better. And if you just look at the report by yourself, that you're doing everything wrong, rather than the total thing. This is the way the report came out, that there was like a delegation, especially because my two department heads that never accepted anything but laissez-faire of running their own shops, that they didn't want to be part of the team, had talked to them about these things. And with that, and with the election of 71% of the vote more than the councilman got, I went through an uneasy period for about a year. They were talking about getting rid of me. I weathered the storm, and when I was leaving, everything was fine, including the person from the Woodward government that went on the council to get me initially was a supporter of the system, which made me pleased in doing this.
So there are really no safeguards, somebody in your position as city manager.
No, I say in one of my jokes that I haven't had many of them, but a city manager goes into a city like he leaves it, fired with enthusiasm. So it's part of the game you play. So that basically was Fort Collins. Again, a great city, lovely place to live. We lived a block from the campus. All the amenities of lectures, music, athletics, lots of good things happening. So, and things going well at that time.
But another opportunity came your way then.
Opportunity came my way. I have to talk a little bit about my wife at this stage, because I think the spouse is an important part. In fact, it's not only important, it's the critical part in a manager's career. But we have sessions at our city manager meetings on how two career people, in a family, can get along. One of the things I mentioned about my wife, and I gave this to the council, just our 4 children, at her 80th birthday a year and a half ago, that she graduated from high school, valedictorian, was selected as most popular, most likely to succeed, most versatile, went to Cornell on a 4-year scholarship, cleaned houses, did work in the cafeteria, was a reporter on the daily paper and editor of the Cornell Countryman. Graduated, became an extension agent in upstate New York. Had the youngest extension agent in the state. Had a car, 2 secretaries, had built up from 4 clubs to 40 clubs throughout the county, a weekly newspaper article, a weekly radio program, and a job she loved. Now, we had met in our sophomore year. We both were on summer jobs. She was working as manager of a YMCA cafeteria, and I was working for the Navy surveying. We met, and before I went overseas, we got engaged. I had finished 3 years of college. I came home, and she willingly gave up this job, and we went to Boulder, Colorado. At Boulder, she immediately started to teach at the School of Home Economics there. worked on a master's as long as I was working on my master's. She got a master's on diet and pregnancy and lactation. Couldn't find a subject, so we had a child that was a subject for her thesis on management and diet and pregnancy and lactation. Again, nursed the baby all the time. Took jobs that would only make her home. When we left there to go to Chicago, we had to live in a small bedroom and sub-rent apartment that was just bare enough for the bed and the crib. And one of the reasons I left was that we had one child and one on the way. She willingly went to way out in Minot, North Dakota. Had to stay in Minot, North Dakota. She taught at the University of North Dakota at Minot. She taught there. After I left, she had to stay, finish her contract, and help sell the house. Then followed me with two small children to Milton Freewater. At Milton Freewater, she had to live through having one daughter, we all did, that had operations and finally died of brain cancer. And then willingly came back to Chicago to, when I was at Fort Collins, she decided to go back to school, got a fellowship and a grant to pay 100% of her 3 years to get a PhD. And then she was being offered jobs. She was considering a job as a dean of a small girls' college in Richmond, Virginia, an associate professorship at Pullman, Washington, and assistant director of extension in Minneapolis for the state of Minnesota. And we said to ourselves, wait a minute, if we're going to have two careers, we have to get to a metropolitan area. So I had known Marv Andrews, and the position was open for the deputy city manager of, and I did want to work in a big city. It was part of my some experience. And so was very fortunate that I was able to get the job, and she fortunately was able to find work with the University of Arizona as the extension agent for Maricopa County. In that job, she wrote 2 books and got 2 or 3 major awards, but she was as I said, the real hero in our family. So that gets me to Phoenix.
Okay. Let's just take a quick break here for a moment.
Good.
Okay. That was great the way you added that. My name is Nancy Dillette, and I'm an oral historian at Arizona State University. And today is Monday, September 20th, 2004. I'm joined by Noel Stowe, chair of the history department at Arizona State University, and he's also director of the public history program. And together, we're continuing to interview Bob Brunton, who served as deputy city manager for the city of Phoenix from 1977 to 1986. In our earlier conversations, you got us just up to the point where you were about to come to Phoenix as deputy city manager. So if you want, I think it's a good idea to talk about some of the connections from the work you had done before that got you here.
It's very interesting that I call it all roads lead to Phoenix. First of all, when I first went to work for the ICMA, the first person I met was Selden Kent, who was a deputy city manager, was one of our staff people, at the ICM office and stayed with us about 6 to 8 months after I came. Also, Sam Vickers, one of the old-time city managers here, was president of ICMA and on the board when I was assistant director. Then I met, the main person I met was my best friend in the city manager profession was a person by the name of Ray Botch, who at that time was city manager of Elgin. We had met and worked together when we were both in cities in Oregon. Every Friday night I would go to Elgin to teach ICMA courses in techniques of administration or lead the group. You don't teach, lead the group there. Supervisory administration and public works administration. At that time, Marv Andrews was the administrative assistant, and he met me at the train depot and took me to City Hall for the meetings. Ray Botch and I talked many times about city personnel, and he was very fond of Marvin Andrews. In fact, he said he's the best assistant he ever had. And he used the phrase, Marv fit in like an old shoe, very comfortable with both the city staff and the city council and the public. And he felt there were big things for him. And I agreed with him, and his prediction was right about Marv. So anyway, who would know that many years later he would be in that position. We had 2 ICMA conferences in Phoenix. The only city I know of in the last 50 years that has had 2 international meetings in the city. Both meetings were tremendous. I used to tell the joke, though, when I was in Chicago, that old Joe was sick and he went to Phoenix to recuperate. And after being there 2 weeks, he died. And they brought the body back to Chicago, and his wife and 2 friends looked at the body, and his wife said, Joe looks pretty good. And the first fellow said, yes, he looked better than he did in a long time. And the third fellow said, those 2 weeks in Phoenix did him a lot of good. So who would know that my 10 years in Phoenix would do me a lot of good in terms of things. And after that, I met Bob Coop, who I knew from the 1313 public personnel days, and Bob became city manager here. And Sam Vickers, after he retired as city manager, acted as a consultant to the city of Joliet, Illinois, when I was at Elgin, Illinois. And he asked me to come over there once or twice to help him with Illinois law. And before I knew it, he had set up for me to be offered a position as city manager in Joliet. And I said, wait a second, Ray, I'm already city manager in Elgin. But anyway, we had fun together working in the city there. So I felt right at home. The last one, John Wendt was president of ICMA when I was on, and he was on the board when I was regional director of ICMA. I always remember John, very bright, very articulate, but loved to talk. And he was on national television once when I was still back, I think, in Fort Collins, that they said that the city manager of Phoenix wrote a memo to staff saying you should make your memo shorter. And then the person said his memo was 3 pages long. So this was John. All the city managers, Phoenix has had great city managers. I mean, some of I think the icons in the profession over the years. I think the difference between the other city managers and Marv is Marv learned how to become invisible. He learned how to take a back seat to the rest of the group. And we'll talk about Marv a little later, but on the matter. But this was Phoenix, my introduction to Phoenix.
So it's 1977. And what were some of the challenges of Phoenix at that time that attracted you to take the job as city manager here?
Well, they needed a person who would be in the development coordination area. That included engineering, planning, traffic engineering, building inspection, water and sewer. And the very exciting area because they were going, Phoenix was in the throes of going through major development at that time. And the council were concerned that there was not enough coordination. So I took the job, and the first person that became my assistant was George Flores. And we formed the Development Coordination Office. The main thing we did is that parts of many of the major departments, the engineering, the water, the sewer, the planning, have to deal with developers. And the real issue was how we can get those various parts to work together. To a developer, delays cost a lot of money. And to the city, they want to make sure that their requirements are met. And the thing to get these together is to get the attitude of the people working in this area to be concerned about the development community, not give in to them, but be concerned about helping them on their mission. And this was George and my job as we formed the development coordination. We have that one picture with the city council asked us, and we had ads in all the Chamber of Commerce of Greater Phoenix had ads in all the professional business magazines about these people keep people moving and put moving van uniforms on us. And we set this up and worked out and got a new coordination office system going right away.
Who were some of the developers that you needed to coordinate services for? Were they existing developers or people that you wanted to attract in the future, or both? And who were you competing with?
The ad says we want to attract, the main thing we want to do is attract new or industries and businesses to the city. But we also had the ongoing business community, like one of the ones was Bob Gosnell, who took both the points at Tapatio North and the South Mountain Tapatios. And he was an example of how to get through the red tape. And I could really have a whole story of working with Bob Gosnell.
What was the competition if you were trying to attract businesses and developers to Phoenix? What were the cities at that time in the late 70s that you were competing with?
Well, I think the whole San Diego area, more so the Los Angeles area, the Las Vegas area, we were competing with as we were looking at the thing.
Were there some particular people that you looked to bring to Phoenix in those other area, from those other areas that
We didn't do too much of that. We left that to the Chamber of Commerce to do that part of it. The promotion part was the Chamber. They felt this was their responsibility. We should be there greeting the people and working with them.
Who were some of the people that they were courting to come to Phoenix rather than San Diego and Las Vegas?
People in the electronic businesses, mainly. The people like Honeywell and Motorola, Intel, and not much in the heavy industry field.
Mm-hmm. Was it more about getting, so it was more about Honeywell and Motorola and Intel were here already, right?
Yeah, but yeah,
So it was
getting
making the climate
getting
so that they could
additional
expand.
plants and getting people like that to work with them.
Okay. How many deputy city managers were there in Phoenix at that time?
There were 5 of us.
And what were their areas of specialty?
One was the person in, maybe there were only 4 at first, the personnel area, and the finance, that was Selden Kent. Glenwood Wilson, who just died last week, had the human resources at that time. Severo Esquivel, although he was not there initially, had the public works and the street maintenance.
So this was creating a new
Yeah.
position, a new deputy manager?
A new deputy
Position.
manager for Development Coordination Office. A very interesting thing, the word development, the deputy manager, the city charter says that the city manager may only have 1 assistant. And there was a person by the name of Art Kaufman who challenged us on many things. And he challenged this and took it to court. And during the interim, while this was in court, we changed the title of the deputies to urban service managers in the area. And we then, after that, went back to deputy city manager, but also carried at times the urban service manager form. In fact, I had a big placard, I didn't bring it with me. It's 3.5 feet by 2.5 feet, signed by 75 to 100 of the people in the Parks and Recreation Department. I had Parks and Recreation for several years later on. But what they said on the big plaque with their signatures is what I envision the job of a deputy is. They said, Robert L. Brunton, Urban Service Manager at Phoenix, because you were willing to take chances besides us. When things got rough, you kept the back seat. When acrylics came in, you showed real interest, attended our programs, chatted our progress, sung our praises. You were there when we needed you. Will be missed when you are gone, but we wish you well. Now this to me is what I consider my envisionment of the deputy manager being the ideal job of being, meshing in and being part of the department there, rather than you don't take it over, you become part of it. So anyway, that's the way the thing was operated.
How about if we talk a little bit about...
Let me talk about 2 other initial things that happened. We had a major problem in our water and sewer department. It was, the sewer department was almost at war with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. For some reason, our water and sewer director felt that the EPA were not there to do anything but get in your way. And his feelings was that if the times got rough, Mayor Hance would go back to Washington and just say, keep those boys off our back. He didn't realize that they were for real. Now, this not only complicated our job, and I must have gone to San Francisco at least a dozen times to work with the EPA people and to mend fences along with the staff we had. It made it complicated in that these studies were also in connection with what we call our SHROG, our sub-regional operating group, where other cities received treatment from 91st Avenue Treatment Plant, Mesa and Tempe, and to a lesser degree, some of the other areas, unincorporated areas. So they were vitally interested along with us in this. And we finally got the thing through, but this was one of the major stumbling blocks that I had initially and had to work through.
What were you arguing about?
What?
What were you arguing about with the EPA? What did you argue about with the EPA? What were the issues?
The requirements of all these nitty-gritty, detailed requirements that they required. The whole procedure that as they wrote in and asked for additional information that they didn't get it. It was more of a procedural problem than and an attitude problem more than a technical problem.
So it wasn't water quality or
No.
pollution and those sorts of things. It was literally procedural?
One thing that really amazes me, we had our major plant, we had two plants at 23rd Avenue and 91st Avenue. We had sludge drying beds, and I never could find out when I first came what happened to the sludge because we didn't have to process it, and I gradually realized that we waited for there to be a flood in the river, and then the sludge bed would conveniently open up, and would make the farmers happy with the sludge going down. This was stopped as we worked on the thing also.
Now, did you build and increase the capacity of those plants, or were those adequate at that time?
No, we had to expand onto them onto 91st Avenue. 23rd was the same.
So that was one of the solutions to the problem?
Right, yes, solutions and modernizing it.
That was an area-wide effort, right, if I remember right, with the other cities to do that? Because it's a metropolitan area service plant, right?
Yeah, we as a city were solely responsible, but we had the other cities we met and tried to use them as co-equal partners in the process. I remember especially one person from Mesa who I had great respect for was a person named Dean Sloan, who was head of all their water, sewer, electric, and gas, because Mesa has the whole area of utilities. So our meetings, we met as a group and discussed the issues, but Phoenix was solely responsible to EPA for it.
Is there anything unique about the fact that Phoenix served all the other cities with that plant? Is that different from other urban areas, the way this was worked out?
To a large degree, I think it's unique. I don't think many other urban cities have as many major urban cities around the central city. I mean, all the Mesa, Tempe at that time were substantial areas by themselves.
Well, this enabled them not to have to duplicate all of that, as I remember, correct? Right.
We also had problem we had a major lift station on Ray Road and I-10 that served Ahwatukee at that time, was outside the city limits, and part of Tempe, and people pumped their sewer to our lift station, and then we pumped it across the mountain to a major line going out to the 91st Avenue plant. And we had some problems with that pump station breaking down, and had some uneasy days as we got it repaired so we keep the thing moving.
Talk about some of the issues that, that were contentious between Phoenix and Tempe and Phoenix and Scottsdale and others in terms of annexation and how Phoenix was growing at the same time that other cities were. What were some of your major annexation?
The annexation by itself became a very difficult thing because we were really at certain stages and at war with the other cities. Tempe was was not a player because they were completely surrounded. Scottsdale was the mayor player, along to a lesser degree with Glendale and Peoria. We went out at a mad rates to annex property. We went over a period of time all the way out to Carefree Highway. I used to tell the joke, the people living way out north never want to be in the city of Phoenix or in Scottsdale. They just want to be left alone. And the story is about the knight's been away from the castle for about 7 or 8 months. And he comes back to the castle and he's all battered and bruised and cut up. And the king says, "Where you been?" He said, "Well, I've been up north raping and ravaging the enemy to the north." The king says, "We don't have any enemy to the north." The knight said, "You do now." And so this is what we did in doing this. And I think to a certain degree, part of the annexation was a little bit irresponsible. At least we on staff thought so, but we did what we were told. In that we had it added to the one stumbling block for Phoenix is our urban sprawl, hurting transportation, hurting your utility extensions and things of this type. And all we did was have a field day for developers who try to pit one city against the other to try to get as many concessions as they could from the city. And some of us on both of the staffs felt it would be better if we worked together, not only on our annexation, but on development. We had one talk about a development up north that never came to being, that we didn't care where the development took place, whether on the Scottsdale side or the Phoenix side. We would share somehow in the sales tax from that development. There weren't enough of these dialogues going on a real meaningful basis, because we as staff can only go so far, and then you hit a dead wall on the thing.
Can you remember one of the annexation wars that would be a good example of creating this kind of conflict where you might have worked it out with more discussion and collaboration?
Oh, we had an unusual annexation before I came along I-10, that we strip annexed a piece of land about 100 feet wide all the way down I-10 because Ahwatukee wouldn't come in the city limits. And Tempe was chomping at the bits to jump the I-10 and get more land on the west side. And we wanted to get all that vacant land south of South Mountain. So we finally got Ahwatukee to come in by saying no more services for development unless you come in the city limits. and that when I first came, the land south of South Mountain was just a piece of vacant land with a proving ground for testing heavy equipment, and now I guess has 150,000 people there in that area. So this was one of the examples of how you used the utility to force an annexation.
There's more on annexation, or?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on. There were two events, or one event that you wanted to talk about, the 100-year flood.
Yeah. The Salt River is usually dry, and most people would say they haven't seen water in it for years. We had the chance of having 200-year floods within about a 3-year, 4-year period. The floods happen by a combination of several things happening. First of all, you have a heavy snowpack in the high country. Then you have warm weather and rain and wind. And you get the area, and then you have the reservoirs that were filled, and SRP, to save the dams, had to release water. So you get all three of those things coming together, and you have a major flood. We had the flood, the first one, we opened our command post, the emergency center, for about 4 days.
What year is this that you're talking about?
Behind the emergency center was the basement of the police station.
And what year is it that this happened?
About 1979, I guess. Someplace 79, 80 area. Marv was, as usual, in charge, but turned over to staff the manning of the station. One of us or two of us deputies were down there 24 hours a day, having areas. To save the system, we had to, all our bridges went out. We had to cut out the approaches to the bridges through engineering and public works and let the water go around both sides of them. The only bridge that was open really was the Mill Avenue Bridge, and that fortunately was built on bedrock, so it had a good foundation for it. We also had to run the train for a few days because the train was on the same bedrock, and run trains for a short time downtown. So we got over the system, but as an offshoot of that thing, we got the money to build major storm sewers. There's one storm sewer down on about 3rd Street that you can ride a truck in. That's that size to take care of some getting the water down to the river on that. Plus building better bridges. It's easy to criticize, but it's when you don't have the money, you put bridges in, and where all the bridges going across sort of have no bedrock. So it's a very difficult job to build bridges that are like the luxury of Mill Avenue Bridge, that is on the good foundation. But again, we got these things for 2 different floods.
Well, as I recall, also you built low-flow bridges initially.
Yes.
And the idea was that there was never much water coming down the river, so there was no need for something like either the Mill Avenue Bridge or the I-10 bridge.
Right.
And so in the first flood, they all went out like they were supposed to, except we then had another flood. So you built a very different kind of bridge then after the second flood, right? I mean, you came back and...
Yeah, we built different bridges that could first of all, without having to take out the the approaches
Right.
could keep the traffic going. The interesting thing is right after the 100-year floods, we went from the floods to a water shortage, feast or famine. The article I have about Marv Andrews,
You probably ought to hold that.
although
You could go ahead.
this was where the Invisible Man, a very large article, long article on Marv Andrews, and what a great job he did do and is doing, or was doing, in Phoenix. But the interesting thing is that all of the people photographs in the thing are all affected with the water department, or picture of me, a picture of Max Palmer, our director at that time, Walt Slago. We had a full-time person by name of that was formerly our head of our Corps of Engineers and came over to the city, Bill Chase, that did nothing else for the city but study water and keep in touch with the water, and advised all of us on water. We also had 2 people on our own staff that were specialists in the water areas. Plus we hired Bill Stevens, an outside consultant at lawyer, to be on the thing. So everybody worked together on this, and Marv showed a great deal of interest in the water. In fact, when I came, he was handling water himself until he turned it over when I came in '77. What basically happened, the city of Phoenix, before we had the Colorado River water, got all of its water supply from the Salt River Project, plus the wells that we had, many wells. We got the Salt River water, this SRP water, from an allotment that what we called on project land, any land that were in the area that Salt River Project serviced. If that land was retired and didn't use the water, but used it for development, would get 2 acre-feet per acre of credit of water behind one of the reservoirs to supply water for the city of Phoenix. The other thing that we had was that the city of Phoenix put in some gates at the Horseshoe Reservoir that got us an additional, and all that water that when the reservoir was filled, all that water became City of Phoenix water. Well, back in about 1980, we had used up all of our gate water credits, and Salt River were really making life making it miserable for us in terms of doing things, and we had to continually. I know I went before with Jack Feaster and went to the board meetings there at least on a dozen occasions to tell them that we were going to be good boys and follow the restrictions that they had there. And at that time, we again talked about the same thing we always talk about during whether you have a gas shortage or a water shortage, you always talk about conservation. Once the shortage is over, you forget conservation again. But we talked about conservation. We talked about getting additional water supply, and talked about like mining water by making ponds, letting the water percolate down and building up a mine of water. We talked about buying up ranches and getting the water rights and moving them down to the Phoenix area. All these things take time. But then the Colorado River water came in. And I would like to say about the city of Phoenix I think our water department did a great job in getting ready for Colorado River water, as contrasted to Tucson, that try to resist it all the time and resist the CAP program on the thing. Because to us, the Colorado River water caused real havocs in our whole system of treatment. We had different treatment for well water, for the water coming from the Salt River Project area and from CEP water. And the city staff had to make arrangements on all three of these. Some people don't realize that the Colorado River water was not additional water to a large degree. It was to take the place of our pumping water from the wells. And we had to pass a groundwater legislation. And among that thing, like in the pumping of the wells, when you pump a well, as you take the water in the well, the water level goes down. And when you turn that well off, it's what that level goes back to. And according to the regulations of the groundwater legislation, once we stopped pumping and the groundwater went up again, we had to be at the static level, had to be at the same level as the after pumping level. Because the big reasons for the Colorado River was the wells eventually were going further down. They're costing more money to pump water with electrical bills. The chemicals were being higher grade chemicals and more chemicals to treat. And then you had the whole question of subsidence. And these were the reasons we got this. So all these things had to be blended in the water department.
Now, did you have to change the water treatment plants at all to take care of CAP water?
Yes. A lot of that was done after I left.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about the conservation measures that were taken? Because today we're talking about how they've been effective over a long period of time.
Well, I think we started, first of all, this was not conservation as much, but all of the wastewater that we get from the 91st Avenue treatment plant goes out to Palo Verde for their cooling purposes in the Palo Verde APS plant. They have to do additional treatment because they need cleaner water. We also talked about all the golf courses using gray water. John Long, one of our developers, was a pioneer trying to get developments to use gray water for watering their areas, among other things. John Long really tried to do many interesting things in the whole area. He tried to get like an all-electric village of 100 homes, and he was going to provide all the villages with solar energy and buy each family a electric car. And we worked with John on that program, which was very interesting. He never got the full grant that he needed to pull it off, but it's with getting back to water conservation. He worked with us on trying to get the water conservation program.
Did you work on the groundwater legislation?
No, that was done. Okay. And we had 3 attorneys plus Bill Chase plus 2 private attorneys. We talked with them about it, but the legislation was in the hands of the group that form the commission on that.
This was a really important time in terms of the city going in one direction or another in terms of conservation. And so on the one hand, you're talking about working with developers and trying to attract people here and industry. On the other hand, you're having water shortages and trying to figure out how Phoenix can grow within certain limits. How did those things get balanced out?
I think you're governed by legislative bodies that are looking for growth. I think if you talk to the major people in the planning staff, for example, they go along or have to go along with whatever the elected officials say. But they felt that some of the growth was irresponsible. And this was started years ago. I mean, that we allowed people to develop, and staff felt they should be doing more in infill before we extend new lines and new things out. Plus the fact that we will always lose money. I know in transportation, two of the cities I worked in, we had small bus systems. In Elgin, during World War II areas, the city of Elgin's private bus company made lots of money because people didn't get gas. We had a franchise and fees for them. They started to lose money as time went along. We finally had to cut out all their special fees. And then they finally came back to us and said, will you buy the company? And I said to them, you weren't there when we wanted to share the profits, but you're there when you want us to share the losses. And so many times in Elgin and in Fort Collins, where the bus company, I asked them, you tell me how much money you want to lose, and I'll tell you what type of bus company we can have. Because it's a given that without subsidies and without things, and a bus, transportation's there for more reasons that are then making money. They have a real service feature for the city. You could go into that whole long discussion on that by itself. But what it does by our urban sprawl, it makes it more difficult. And we talk more here about park and ride rather than having direct transportation down because of the urban sprawl situation.
Can you talk a little bit about what you were telling the Intels and Honeywells and Motorola's about the conservation of water and the lack of water, since this is becoming an important issue at this time? Did they raise those questions? Were they worried about that? Or how did you approach that?
Well, I think most of them had just confidence in the city that they would be taken care of. They did, the better companies did take care of the conservation. Several of them went to desert landscaping. They put in water savings devices. I recall during one conservation that they had, if it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down, was one of the slogans of the trying to conserve. And they did cooperate in all these things. I think most of our corporate citizens were true corporate citizens in that they did show real concern.
Did it inhibit them at all from thinking about coming to the valley?
I'm sure a few of them did. But most of them, we assured that with all the things that were happening, we could take care of them. Just a few words on a part of the system, and that's streets. Now, like everything else, as I mentioned, the city, many people are involved. And we had our street administrator, Ed Hall, who coordinated on a day-to-day basis most of the major street improvements. I had two interesting brushes on the streets. The first one was back when I first came, Phoenix had a reputation of being the only major city with the fewest number of freeway miles in the country. People were fighting the freeways. The city of Phoenix had a study made on historic buildings in the Moreland corridor. And a group were contesting that study. So Arizona Department of Transportation, ADOT, flew me for 3 days up to Prescott to Judge Craig's court. I only had to be there 1 day, but I kept on postponing my visit. And before I got on the stand, they was trying to say, did we receive or did we adopt the report? And all I had to say, we didn't adopt it, we received it. Because if we had adopted it, we would have slowed the freeway down by another, who knows, several months, several years maybe, that the group were contesting the thing at times. So, and the other one that I had, the unique difference, back in the 1980, around that, maybe a little later, city of Chandler wanted a overpass or across Ray Road. Tempe wanted one at Warner Road. Phoenix.
This is on I-10, right?
On I-10. Phoenix was more in favor of Ray Road. The problem was that ADOT made a requirement for to put the overpass in, or the interchange. The city had to provide the land. Tempe already had the money for the thing. Neither Phoenix nor Chandler had money in their budget for this. Don Brown, the city manager, Chandler came to Marv Andrews, and then Marv had him come to me. And he said, he told him what the problem was. We came up with a unique solution that we went to all the property owners and say, having this interchange will help the value of your property. So we set up a formula for going back a mile or mile and a half on either side, and the land closest to the freeway was charged more per foot than the others. And I think we raised $3 million voluntarily. And the only person of all the property owners that turned us down was a person by the name of Kemp Amali, who at that time had a junkyard on the Phoenix side. Fortunately, we had enough money at that time to and we got the interchange in. So when I retired, Don Brown came to the retirement party and labeled this as the Robert L. Brunton interchange. So it was a fun thing to work on with Don Brown for that time.
As I remember in the preceding example that you used for the Moreland Corridor project and all the historic preservation controversy that came out of that, that actually caused a redesign of the interstate through central Phoenix, where they had initially had a very high profile freeway that was 100 feet in the air and going through the historic part of town. And it,
yes, that.
I mean, out of all of that, there came a lot of discussion and negotiation, right?
Yeah. This discussion, I was just at the staff meetings on. Ed Hall handled the thing along with Marv Andrews. We did have all sorts of different designs for the freeway, and only very late did we come up with the one of having the below ground and having the Margaret Hance
The park.
park above it, which was a very, I think, a good solution. But I was not privy to the decision making
Okay.
on that one.
Right.
Talk a little bit more about the situation that Phoenix was in terms of lack of roads and freeways. And my understanding was that there was a lot of opposition in the press to new roads, the 202, the I-10, and which obviously affects public opinion. So just talk about that period of time where Phoenix really has to make a decision whether they're going to construct new roads
Yeah,
and
why?
freeways or not.
As we talked about the Mullen corridor and getting the I-10 completed, there's always people that are opposing the progress. We had the same thing going on 51, where we had to make the Highway 51 was a city project as compared to I-10 being a state federal problem. With the neighbors there, we had to make, and maybe rightfully so, all these walls and various other things and landscaping, and I think justified, because the people who you condemn the land to get, they get the money to get out. The people that are mainly affected are the people that have to stay there. They don't need their land, but they show the full brunt of the highway. So we went out of our way on 51 to work with the neighbors on frontage roads, on landscaping. Some of the landscaping was, I think, a little ridiculous. Like on 51, we have some pots and things that I don't understand what art they are, but the art committee wanted them, so they put them in.
So that was after the Phoenix had adopted the 2% for our
Right.
program.
And I think it's unfortunate. I noticed in this latest one, I just noticed in the paper yesterday, that the Jewish Recreation Center that now has to be relocated to put one of the train stations in, and the people in the Jewish center there on the west side are resisting it. It makes it difficult because two things that always concern me philosophically is, one is the power of the city to have eminent domain, and you should use that very carefully to confiscate a person's property, because what's progress to the majority of people is confiscation to the few that had to be relocated. And so you expect to have some opposition on any major program to people who are going to be directly affected. But the price of progress means you cannot satisfy all people.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the social problems that are developing in Phoenix while you're deputy city mayor.
Yeah, well, one of the real interesting ones that I had was working for about, I had development coordination office in its totality for around 6 years. And then we rotate deputies once in a while with an upside and downside to rotation. I could talk about both of those, but I took human resources at a very interesting and critical time. We were talking about the homeless situation, and the city of Phoenix very, I think, wisely said that this is not a city of Phoenix problem, it's an area problem. I recall one time when I was at a meeting, they didn't know who I was, but two Tempe city council members were talking, and a person asked them how they handled the homeless situation. And they said, well, we send them to Phoenix. And the major central city usually is the place where the depository for all these things. You have, first of all, you have the place where the homeless can give their blood and make money, where they have the services. St. Vincent de Paul has a soup kitchen, a very good one, feeding meals. And so we said the homeless need to be handled a little better. And the city of Phoenix also took out all the single resident occupancy places, the SROs, and left them so they had none of those places. We took out the deuce where the homeless could be in the daytime, and again they had to roam the streets. The legislature were complaining about the homeless around the state capitol, and especially around the Brunton Public Library site. So a Central Arizona Shelter Service group was formed, which we were part of. We had one major meeting where we were down to two sites. One was at the one that we now have at Jefferson and about 13th Avenue, and the other one was south of the railroad tracks and west of 15th Avenue. I voted along with the majority for the present site as being the most acceptable of unacceptable alternatives. The county bought the land, or the county had some of the land, and they provided, once we got started, the medical services down there. And also in the building that was existing, the families could be in there. The city of Phoenix put in a barrack-type shed for housing the homeless men, and we put a tent city behind there, which was a disaster. The people who had dogs or pets could not live in the place, and so we initially was feeling, well, we will provide them with a place to live. And the city of Phoenix put in showers and lavatory and everything else for the outside people. Our Stilwell, who had been a former Salvation Army colonel there, operated the place for a while, and he said it's impossible to operate the tent city, it's a jungle. And so we finally had to give up and abandon that area. But the other cities made contributions to CAS along with the city of Phoenix. And with the county doing the health, I found out two things about the homeless. One of the health people say one of the biggest medical problems the homeless have is their feet, because they walk so much. And also people criticize the homeless for sleeping in the daytime when they see them sleeping around there. They sleep in the daytimes many times because they're afraid to sleep at nighttime, because they're being rolled or being stuff stolen from them. So you get to understand and appreciate. And I think Cass has done an effective job in operating that for us. And I was just glad to be there for a couple of years. The other part of the program that I worked on there, that helped somewhat, the state of Arizona wanted to have the Borden Museum, the Borden Library, by the way the Borden Library was given to the city of Phoenix. We could not sell it. So we negotiated with the state.
Which library is this?
What?
Which one?
The Borden, the major library, it's between Jefferson and Washington, about 10th Avenue.
Carnegie.
Carnegie.
Carnegie Library. The Carnegie Library?
Yes.
Yeah.
The I call it Borden, but Carnegie.
Okay.
That's a better name for it than the Borden. The homeless were using that property, hundreds were sleeping in that property. So we got this 25-year lease, $1 a year for 2 25-year periods. And now the state has made that into a major museum for, with all the women in Arizona history, and the Congressional Medal Honor medal winners in Arizona in that library, among other things. Plus the fact that they landscaped it and kept it away from the homeless to make the legislature more happier. So the reason I didn't go for the other site, the one that at least I had good, in my mind, good reasons. It was safer for the homeless to be on the same side of the railroads they were working on, rather than having to walk across the railroad tracks continually, because the St. Francis, the St. Paul, the eating facility for them, and the blood bank area were there, and other services they had were on the north side of the railroad tracks. So I think we made a wise decision there.
Mm-hmm. Did you think that Phoenix was equipped at the time to think through how to deal with a social problem like homelessness? It sounds like on the one hand you're saying the city was tearing down the SROs and then having to build other places and trying to export the problem from one place to another. Did Phoenix have a real sense of what was Phoenix's responsibility to provide homes for the homeless?
I don't think, and I really don't know, but I don't think that people gave much thought about what they were doing at the time. Mm-hmm. Because I think inexpensive housing for the homeless is a very worthwhile program. Mm-hmm. The only place you had in that, you shouldn't even use the one, is the YMCA has. Mm-hmm. Something for it, but that's a little higher level of homeless, mm-hmm. or single people that want to live there.
Was there a model of another city that had adopted a particular way of dealing with homelessness?
I don't think
the city.
I've heard no city that has handled the homeless situation well. Mm-hmm. It's just something you hope goes away.
Do the other cities then just really rely on Phoenix? Were they just relying?
That's right, yes.
You used Tempe as an example, but would you just think of the other cities?
I think that's the best thing. I mean, it's I'm sure they have some minor problems in all the cities with homeless people that want to roam and want a better life.
And CAS refers to what? What does CAS mean?
Central Arizona Shelter System. Is that right?
So that,
CAS? Central
CAS.
Arizona?
Yeah, CAS, Central Arizona Shelter Service.
Okay. Let's talk, you had mentioned that at one point the deputy city managers went on a rotation,
Yes.
and so at one point you're doing development services and then you move over into resources, human resources and personnel?
I never had personnel. I had during the rotation, I had Public Works for a while, and I had Parks and Recreation, libraries.
What's the idea behind rotating city managers to serve in those different positions?
I think Marv felt fresh outlook on the situation. That's the upside. The downside is the continuity. I recall one unfortunate situation of having, I only had Public Works for a short time, maybe about a year, but we were briefed by our accounting people who oversee and look for studies on how to improve service. They were concerned about the gas at one of our areas for our vehicles to get their gas supply. They felt that should be better accounting to make sure there's no leaking taking place. I, as the new taking over, met with them along with the other one. I'm trying to get the sequence on this. And we talked about it. And then, lo and behold, about a year and a half later, somebody didn't check far enough in the thing, and they were having tremendous amount of gasoline going into the ground. And it took us tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to clean up the gas that had gone into the subsoil there. And if you had one continuity of one urban service manager, he would have made sure that the city and the department head on his performance rating system. That is one of his responsibilities.
Was it an experimental situation to rotate, or was that a common thing throughout city management to have the deputy city managers rotate?
I think it's not a common thing. I think it was the Phoenix more.
So
Let me change this will tie together several things. When I talk about Marv Andrews, I mentioned Marvin about his low profile, and that he also felt that he had to spend, and rightfully so, most of his time with the mayor and city council, and he resigned to the assistant city manager and the deputies the jobs of the day-to-day activities. Here is that there was no question, and no uncertainty, who was in charge. It was just a question that he couldn't get involved with doing all these things and that. One of the several of the many innovations he made, as we brought out, one was performance ratings, that we tied in performance ratings to salaries. And in this, each year, Marv had a performance rating with the council, with the city council, and we each had one with him on what things we expect to accomplish in the next year. And then on the basis of how well we did on that, your salaries were established. One of the things that was interesting is, and I think critical, is the council wanted with Marv and Marv wanted with us, no surprises. The council did not want to read in the paper about anything happening. If a person took off with $100,000, you call all the councilmen right away before they hear it in the TV or read it in the paper. We had somebody steal $100,000. Likewise, Marv put down the monkey on our back and say, I don't want any surprises also, and read about it anyplace else. If something happens, I don't care if it's at nighttime or any time. If you think it's worthy, you call me up on that. Another interesting thing he did, and we got several awards for, was our privatization programs. We, especially in the solid waste collection system, bid against the private sector on the collection of solid waste. And we could do that because we had an auditor's office, independent of the mainstream, that put the figures together for the city, what it would cost the city. And one or two cases we lost, one or two cases we won. But we never had more than 50% to 60% of the solid waste by a private collector, because if there was a strike or anything like that happened, we didn't want to be taken down right away. We wanted to be in control of the situation. We also did privatization on some of our maintenance in our areas on the streets, on the streetscape area that we, so this was again a good thing, except the downside is possibly some people in the labor movement will say, well, you in the city pay higher salaries than they're paying in the public sector, with all your salaries and fringe benefits that we don't have to pay them. So it's a combination on things, but again, I asked the question, why can't a city make money once in a while or try to save money for the citizens? I think one of the biggest things that we happened that I really compliment Marv Andrews on is the thing when we went from the at-large to district election of city council members. We on staff had mixed emotions about going to the district system. Most of your smaller cities don't have district system. There's few advantages to a district system. Is that when you get so large, to have representation and identification with somebody rather than City Hall way up there on the Mecca, on the thing. It wasn't our decision to say whether we liked it or disliked it. The people voted for it, and the thing that happened is the way we handled it was the thing that impressed me. Backing off a little bit, general citizens will not evaluate the way the city is operated by detailed things, how technically we are able to run the water plant, or what good accounting system we have. They will evaluate the city, how promptly you respond to their request, how courteous your employees are to them, how neat and clean they are, how well manicured your streets are. These are the things that impress them. And you have to be careful of and work on and still run a good ship, but make sure that you have the good ship packaged in the right way. So anyway, as soon as we knew we were going to go into the district system, we had a person named Lou Fox, who was the city manager of San Antonio, come in, and they just had gone through going from that large. And Lou told us what happened there. And what he told us it happened almost exactly the same way in Phoenix. The election for the new councilman, the thing that I bring up, why the neat and clean, that the election took place on the second Tuesday in November. The new council took over on January 1. we who had offices on 9th floor were moved out. Offices were made for all the new council members. They had offices, a secretary was hired, and an assistant there. So when they took place on January 1, everything was in place for them to move in. Now this impressed them, that within a 6-week period it can, or 7-week period, get these things done. And so we got to a good understanding with them. And this was, again, Bob's idea on the thing.
Can you talk a little bit about that process of going from at-large to district? What
Yep.
were the different factions in the city? Who came forward to go for a district
Yep.
system? What were the reasons to change at that time?
Well, the reasons, again, were the same reason we talked about urban villages. If we have time, we can talk a little bit about urban villages. Is that as the city gets so big and so spread out, that people want better identification with something closer to home. And so the reasons against the district system is that if you have a lot of needs in one district and not a lot of needs in the other district, you'd provide all the money for the needy district. But if you have a district council member, he wants to make sure he gets his or her fair share of money for his constituents, not caring as much about the needs of the total city. I'm not saying they are oblivious to the needs of the total city, but they're also conscious of satisfying their people who vote for them on the thing. The other thing you have is the potential of trading votes. I'll vote for you if you vote for me on this thing in your area. And it's bound to happen. But I think the district system has worked well. You'd have to ask the manager's office today, or the city manager. I mean, and he wouldn't say at this time whether he thinks it was a worthwhile endeavor. But it's there, and I think that Marv Andrews put it into a good place to start out with.
Was it very contentious about creating the districts?
Oh yes, we had to go back to the federal government on several occasions to make sure you had representation of minorities. And the federal government had to clear all these all these districts.
Did that divide city council in terms of putting that agenda forward, or were they unanimous in wanting district representation?
I think at that time there was more of a feeling towards the districts by the city council, although I don't know whether the existing city council initially, before it was decided to be put on the ballot, whether they were for or against it.
Okay. Do you want to talk more about the creation of some of the urban villages?
Okay. Can I take 1 second?
Sure.
Sure.
You want to take a couple-minute break?
No, I don't need a break. I just want to
Okay.
get one thing out.
What's that?
Don't know.
Marvin Andrews?
Oh, probably.
Maybe. Okay.
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 The urban village concept was started before I came to Phoenix. Again, it was the same type of concept that motivated people for at the district elections. The city was getting so big and so spread out that they wanted to have representations. So they started with 9 villages, and up to 15 members on the commission, with the members appointed by the planning commission and city council. And an interesting sideline, most of the people on the planning commission and most of the council members have been involved in the urban village boards before they came, and I think this is good. In all cities I worked in, I felt there was no better training ground for a city council member than being on the planning commission first. In terms of being able to see the bigger picture that they needed in the situation. So the urban villages today, we have, I think, 21 urban villages now. We have over 500 neighborhood associations that are serviced by the city, or they concentrate on 2 or 3 each year, but to try to bridge the gap between the people who feel left out, and so this has been the good thing. Two of the things we have there in planning, the Biltmore area has always been a prime area for the city, and they set up a special district, again before I came, for the Biltmore area, and any development there was tied in to trip generation. If you're zoned for a certain use, it will generate a certain number of cars. And one of the things we're concerned about in that area is the traffic problems. And so they had a lot of reviews for this whole Biltmore area, but trip generation became part of the requirements. On outside of the Biltmore area, on the south side of Camelback, is the Esplanade. Now there we had, with Fife Symington, wanted to put up a 21-story building to break the code, with the understanding that all the high-rise had to be on Central Avenue, with the real exception of a very low high-rise across from the Phoenix or the Phoenix golf course for that high-rise condominium there. But all high-rises at that time were in the Central Corridor. Had a great deal of discussion on it, had a great deal of meetings, a great deal of animosity. I had to appear before the group. One of the many things was the question of sewers again, and whether we had enough sewer capacity in the area to take that. And we did have to, and we required, if he did this, he was required to pay part of the cost of the improvements. But finally, that was turned down, and he went to the low-rise Ritz-Carlton after a period of time. So that area is, I consider by Phoenix a gem, in that there's a secondary 100% corner that the real estate people talk about in Phoenix area. It has to be there at 24th Street and Camelback.
Was there any discussion at that time about pedestrian access? That's the issue now with that corner. Was that contentious at the time, or not even on the radar screen?
Wasn't on there, no.
Not just build and build for the automobile?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've gotten through most of the list of things that you wanted to talk about in terms of while you were serving as city manager. Do you want to talk about some of your retirement activities?
Yeah, well, I retired in December of 1986. Partially, as I mentioned, because of a hearing problem. I didn't think it was fair to me and fair to the city if I didn't hear everything well. Because with a council member, you can't ask a council member, please speak up louder, or you can't position yourself to be in a seat where you can best be heard, because many times we on staff are sitting back around the thing, and it's essential that you hear everything. Felt like giving back to the community. I've felt this all my life. I was one of the people that started Habitat for Humanity Valley of the Sun. We had a very interesting program in that. I was a president for 3 years. We had infill, first of all, in a barrio, small, then we had a major infill with Central Park, working with the Neighborhood Association, with the City of Phoenix. The City of Phoenix put in new lights. The City Park improved and repaired the park. ASU worked with the architecture department, worked with us. The Historic Methodist Church worked with us. The City of Phoenix Planning Department were happy with us because we were trying to stabilize the neighborhood. People were trying to buy the land and hopefully to get it rezoned industrial. And it was an unfair situation. And the more homes we put in, we had the Phoenix School District, through their trade school, had the students put in 3 houses for us. At the Central Home Builders of Central Arizona put up 2 houses. Various churches put in houses. We did, I think, 15 in that neighborhood and filled on the thing. And to give you an idea of the type of speculation that's going on, a person sold his property to a speculator who was hoping to make a windfall if ever gain industrial, zoned industrial. He paid $30,000 for it. We put Habitat houses on both sides of that place and bought the property for $7,000. When he realized that it was no longer going to be able to make the windfall he wanted, we had to take the loss. So these things work together. So our major project was that the Valley Bank gave us 40 acres of land that was vacant but subdivided, and not subdivided, but zoned and platted. No streets, no sidewalks, no water and sewer, but they gave it to us. We, over a period of time, short time, put in the water and sewer lines. The Phoenix Charities and the Lutheran Brotherhood of America each gave us $100,000 to put a park in. I should back up a second. When we were doing this thing, we had opposition from the neighbors. We had opposition from the city council members in the areas. I won't mention the name of the council member, but that same council member now shows off our project as one of his gems. But anyway, we put in a 200-home South Ranch, where we had a neighborhood association. We required maintenance fees, and that thing is completed now. And we have started, after I left and retired from that, they are putting another 70, and I was pleased for my years with the Habitat. I also was president of the Interfaith Cooperative Ministry for 2 years. They provide food and clothing to the needy. It's required that people like Salvation Army and various agencies will send people to us because we did it with no red tape. And we initially leased space from Salt River Park. They gave it to us for $1 a year on 3rd Avenue, right close to here. And then we finally went to Buchanan and 9th Avenue, and performing a very worthwhile service, providing food. And I also served as the chairman of Senate DOOR Advisory Board. DOOR is developing older aging resources. We had various programs like a VICAP program of volunteers. I volunteered and shopped for 2 elderly invalids on a weekly basis, and did Meals on Wheels every week. And was the token Protestant on the Catholic Peace and Justice Committee for 6 years. So doing those things. So anyway, I kept busy doing things in the community. Now, to give back to my profession, I acted as the range rider for the Arizona City Managers for 8 years. A range rider is an official position established by ACMA, where the State Association and ACMA jointly have a person coming in. We go in and help cities managers that need help, whether you are going to be fired, or whether you're going to have some other problems. Just so have a manager has very few people he can run to talk about things. So we became a listening board to them, and it's been a very effective program throughout our country in doing this. So this kept part of my time. I had to give up most of these things when I had my stroke 4 years ago because I couldn't drive anymore. And so my days of running around Phoenix at a fast clip was curtailed a little bit.
We've had an incredible range of history in the field, serving in 6 or so cities as a city manager, developing the Northwest Association of City Managers, working for ICMA, serving as a range rider.
And as I may be backing up again, one of my most interesting assignments I had with back in the days when they had the Office of Equal Opportunity, the federal government had a committee working on the thing of 2 mayors, 2 city managers, 2 governors, and 2 Indian tribal council president. I was one of the 2 city managers that was on that board for about 3 years. And very interesting assignment that we could have done so much more with that, but the far right would never let us get that far. So eventually, when a person by the name of Phillips got in there, we all resigned en masse. But we did good work at first in the thing, but I was interested in that.
What are some of the characteristics that you think that enabled Phoenix and Arizona to enjoy such a good reputation for good city management?
It's difficult to say. I think we have in Phoenix, in the Phoenix area, one of the finest group of city managers any place in the country. We always look to California as being the mecca for city managers, and California does have a reputation and does have great group of managers. We always I look upon states with having, and this is unusual, having a high-class total group of managers. Wisconsin, Michigan, Texas, North Carolina. The states with the low level are, in my book, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. The others are good, but I mean, but Arizona has to be in the top. I think starting with Ray Wilson, I understand, don't know for sure, but during World War II, in the early days, Phoenix was off limits to the enlisted men in the Army. But Ray Wilson, who they got from Kansas City, who was Secretary of Chamber of Commerce, started the system of building up the managers. Glenwood Wilson, who just died last weekend, was my next door neighbor in the City Hall for 10 years. Started at Chandler, when it was a city of about 4,000 or 5,000. So, but this whole valley was a great place for professional managers. Let me, 2 other subjects, please, so we don't run out of time. One is, I'd like to talk about my philosophy of management, and also maybe talk a little bit about George Flores. I think I'll start on George. As I said, George was my first assistant. Great help to me. I jokingly say that, George, you told me everything I know about this today. I'm completely ignorant. But he did a great job for the city, is the way he progressed up the line. But the association, I've seen very few people, very few managers, never an assistant, and I've been closely involved with the association, directly and indirectly, for over 40 years. Maybe 50 years now, who has done as much to participate in the association work as George. And he also was in the city that allowed this. It's a real, I think Phoenix has, I would say, 35 people that are members of ICMA. And they allow a certain number of people to go to the annual conferences, which is good. Very progressive in this way. George has done his homework well. He was chairman of the Managers and Minority Committee. He was chairman of the Young People in Management. He was on the ICMA Academy and University. Was a vice president at large for ICMA, and took on many assignments. He ran for president at one time, and never got through the maze of things. Backing up a little bit, the little difference now is that when I was regional vice president of ICMA, I was city manager in Elgin, Illinois. I figured that I had been on the association staff. I figured they'd never appoint me. There was the business meeting, and I had tickets for the Yankee baseball team in New York City, and I said, should I go to the baseball game or go to the business meeting? I said, no, the city's paying my way here. I should go to the business meeting. I went there, and that's the first time I knew that I was nominated and elected in one sweep blow as city manager, as regional vice president. Nowadays, they campaign for the job. And they not only campaign, in the old days, the 3 immediate past presidents would decide who would be the nominee for the president job. And that's been changed. That you apply to the board, and the board, you don't run for the job at all. The ICMA board appoint the president. Well, George is in a system that you do this. The only thing against George was that a assistant manager has never been the president. And I think this was a miscarriage of justice on the thing. But
what are some of George's characteristics, or any city manager's characteristics, that you think makes them very effective in their job? What kind of person is best
very
suited?
calm, deliberate, saw the big picture fast, was self-motivated.
What kind of advice would you give to young people starting out thinking about a career in city management?
Well, let me say the philosophy. First of all, you need a sense of humor. One of the reasons they say that Mob selected me as deputy is that when I went to our meetings in Illinois that he attended, I always had a joke or two for the group. And of course I could pick up jokes fast then, because I used to go to the various state meetings of city managers and always picked up the jokes from the various other groups. But we talk about things like a city manager comes into a city like he leaves it. I should say he or she is fired with enthusiasm. And when I say he or she, when I was in Fort Collins, the head of now came up to me and said, Mr. Brunton, it's just as easy to say he and she in all your statements. So whenever I was before council, I said he or she. But on the thing, we also, you say, the city council think very highly of me. They sent me a get well card when I was sick in the hospital. It was passed by a 4-3 vote. And we talk about the city manager who had to leave in a hurry, and he could only write 3 messages, and he put them in sealed envelopes with a note on it. Only open these envelopes if you need them. Well, after he was there about a year, things were going poorly, and they opened and he fired, and the finance director ran off $100,000, and he opened the first slip and said, "Remember, you didn't hire him." So he said to the council, "I didn't hire him." And the same way with the second envelope. And when he was really getting into trouble with the council in the third envelope, he opened it and said, "Write 3 letters on the thing." I think that my philosophy of being a manager is at least I unpacked my bag when I came to the communities I worked in. I wasn't working for, I was working with the city council and felt that I was not the hired hand. I was a member of the community on the things. And this really impressed me when I was back in my days in Milton Freewater. We had lost a daughter who had brain surgery twice, and the community all had prayer sessions for us, all the churches, and got together for us. Maybe this is a sign of a small community, but it's also part that they felt that the Bruntons were there to be part of the community. Mm-hmm. I know that the church I went to, I left on a Monday morning, and I was helping a painting crew on Sunday evening that we wanted to finish the project we had. That felt very deeply that this was that should be part of it. I also got the philosophy in the Army that from a master sergeant that was a professional gambler in Oklahoma City that said, Bob, he said, you size up every situation in 2 cases. If you felt you were going to give in, you gave in graciously. If you weren't going to give in, you fight like hell on the thing. And I also took the philosophy, at first, when I went to, people would pay me compliments for things I didn't do. And I would say, well, I didn't do that. That was done by somebody else. But then they would also blame me for things I didn't do. So I gradually realized that if they're going to compliment me, so I just, when they compliment, I just said thank you on the things. I have this one little thing I kept in my office among things. Doing a good job here is like wetting your pants in a dark suit. It gives you a warm feeling, but nobody notices it. When I retired, I told the group that I had been a lucky guy all my life. a great wife who was my, first of all, I said I have a God, and my window to God is through Jesus Christ, but other people have other windows. A great wife who's my joy, and talked about the kids. Every assignment I had, I enjoyed, even during the bad days. I said, I made peace with myself a long time ago that I never got too high when things were going well, and never tried to never get too low when things were going poorly, because they were all part of the game, and worked on this, and always felt that as a professional, I should act as a professional. And two poems that I have used over and over again in my thing is sometimes when you're feeling important, sometimes when your ego's in bloom, sometimes when you're taken for granted, you're the best qualified in the room. Sometimes when you feel that you're going will leave an unfillable hole, just follow this example and see how it humbles your soul. Take a bucket and fill it with water. Put your hand in it up to the wrist. Pull it out and see in a minute the amount that will be missed. You may splash all you please when you enter. You can stir up the water galore, but stop and you'll find in a minute that it looks just the same as before. The moral of this quaint example is just do the best you can. Be proud of yourself, but remember there is no important, there is no indispensable man. And the other one that I have all the time, isn't it strange that princes and kings and clowns that caper in sawdust rings are common people like you and me, are building for eternity. Each is given a bag of tools, a shapeless mass, and a bag of rules, and each must make, ere life is flown, a stumbling block or a stepping stone. So I try to live by this. So that's my story.
Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time,
Yes,
telling
thank
us your stories. Anything else you want to ask?
you. I don't think so.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.